The last mission. The Arctic wind carved through the settlement of Kaktovik like a blade made of ice and desperation, carrying with it the scent of seal blood and the promise of a storm that would reshape the northern coast of Alaska. Daniel Cruz pulled his parka tighter against his lean frame as he stepped off the small charter plane onto the frozen runway, his breath forming crystalline clouds that disappeared into the vast white expanse stretching endlessly toward the Beaufort Sea. At 26, he possessed the kind of earnest determination that had driven him from his comfortable home in Portland, Oregon, to this remote Inupiat village, where the sun would soon disappear for months and the temperature could drop to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The pilot, a weathered man named Jake Thornton, who had been flying supplies to Arctic villages for over 2 decades, shook his head as he watched Daniel gather his modest belongings from the cargo hold. "You sure about this, son?" Jake called over the engine noise, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many outsiders underestimate the brutal reality of life above the Arctic Circle. "Weather Service is calling for a massive storm system moving in from the northwest. Could ground flights for weeks." Daniel turned back with a smile that seemed almost luminous against the stark landscape, his dark eyes reflecting a faith that had sustained him through 4 years of theological seminary and 2 previous mission trips to remote locations in Guatemala and Alaska's interior. "God called me here, Mr. Thornton," he replied, adjusting the strap of his worn leather satchel that contained his grandmother's Bible, the same one that had traveled with her family from Mexico to California during the Great Depression. "I trust he'll provide what I need." Jake's expression softened slightly, though concern remained etched in the deep lines around his eyes. He had transported countless missionaries, researchers, and government officials to these remote settlements, and while he respected their dedication, he had also witnessed the harsh lessons the Arctic could teach those who approached it without proper respect. "Just remember what I told you about the bears," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "The polar bears around here aren't like the black bears you might have encountered down south. They're apex predators, and with the ice conditions changing, they're coming closer to the village more frequently. The locals know how to handle them, but you need to listen to their warnings." Daniel nodded solemnly, though part of him wondered if the pilot's concerns were perhaps overstated. He had studied the wildlife patterns of the region extensively during his preparation for this mission, reading everything from National Geographic articles to scientific papers published by the U.S. Geological Survey's Alaska Science Center. The statistics, while sobering, suggested that fatal polar bear encounters were relatively rare, particularly in established settlements where proper precautions were taken. What the academic literature couldn't convey, however, was the primal fear that these magnificent predators could inspire when encountered in their natural environment. As Jake's plane disappeared into the grey sky, leaving behind only the fading drone of its engine, Daniel found himself standing alone on the edge of a world that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of human experience. The village of Kaktovik, home to approximately 250 Inupiat residents, stretched before him like a collection of colorful dots scattered across an infinite canvas of white. The houses, painted in bright blues, reds and yellows, stood as defiant statements of human presence against the overwhelming neutrality of the Arctic landscape. Sarah Kanguk emerged from the small terminal building that served as both the airport office and community meeting space, her traditional parka trimmed with wolf fur that her grandmother had taught her to prepare using techniques passed down through countless generations. At 43, she served as the village's unofficial liaison with visiting researchers and religious workers, a role that had developed naturally from her position as head of the local school and her fluency in both English and Inupiaq. Her weathered hands, marked by years of ice fishing and traditional crafts, extended in greeting as she approached Daniel with the measured warmth that characterized Arctic hospitality. "Welcome to Kaktovik," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone equally comfortable in two languages. "I'm Sarah Kanguk. The village council asked me to help you get settled." Her dark eyes assessed Daniel with the kind of rapid evaluation that people in isolated communities developed out of necessity, noting his city-soft appearance while also recognizing the genuine respect in his demeanor. Daniel removed his glove to shake her hand, immediately feeling the biting cold against his exposed skin. "Thank you so much for having me," he replied, his voice carrying the slight accent of his Mexican-American heritage. "I know this arrangement was put together rather quickly, and I really appreciate the community's willingness to let me stay and learn about your culture." Sarah's expression remained neutral, though Daniel detected a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "The council is always interested in building bridges with the outside world," she said diplomatically, "though I hope you understand that our spiritual traditions are very important to us. We're happy to share our culture, but we also expect visitors to approach our beliefs with respect." Tudrish. As they walked toward the village center, Sarah pointed out various landmarks and community buildings, her commentary providing Daniel with his first real glimpse into the complex social dynamics of Arctic village life. The Kaktovik Community Store, operated by the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, served as more than just a place to purchase supplies. It functioned as an informal community center where residents gathered to share news, coordinate hunting expeditions, and maintain the social connections that were essential for survival in such an isolated environment. The store owner, Robert Akivgak, knows more about polar bear behavior than most wildlife biologists, Sarah mentioned as they passed the building. His family has been hunting and tracking bears for generations. If you're planning any walks outside the village perimeter, you should definitely talk to him first. Her tone carried a subtle but unmistakable warning that Daniel filed away for future reference. The house where Daniel would be staying belonged to Mary and Thomas Aknavigak, an elderly couple who had volunteered to host him through the village's guest accommodation program. Mary, whose weathered face reflected 70 years of Arctic winters, greeted Daniel at the door with a gentle smile and the offer of hot coffee that had been brewing on the wood stove since early morning. The house itself was small but remarkably warm, its efficient design reflecting generations of accumulated knowledge about surviving in extreme cold. "You're welcome here as long as you need to stay," Mary said, as she showed Daniel to the small room that would serve as his quarters. "Just remember that in the Arctic, we all look out for each other. That means following the safety rules that keep our community alive." Her tone was kindly but firm, carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the consequences of ignoring such wisdom. Thomas, a retired whaling captain whose broad shoulders still reflected the strength that had once allowed him to handle massive Umiak boats in rough Arctic seas, joined them in the kitchen, where the conversation turned to the practical aspects of Daniel's stay. "The weather radio says we've got a storm system moving in from the west," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate movements. "Could be a big one. You'll want to stay close to the village for the next few days." Daniel nodded, though he felt a small surge of disappointment. He had been hoping to explore some of the traditional hunting and fishing areas that Sarah had mentioned, partly to better understand the subsistence lifestyle that remained central to Inupiat culture, and partly to experience the profound solitude that he believed would enhance his spiritual reflection. "I understand," he said. "I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be here and learn from all of you." Over the next 3 days, Daniel immersed himself in village life with the enthusiasm of someone encountering an entirely new way of understanding the relationship between humans and their environment. He spent mornings at the school, where Sarah taught classes that seamlessly blended traditional knowledge with modern curriculum requirements, and afternoons visiting with elders who shared stories that stretched back to a time when the Arctic was even more isolated from the outside world. Robert Akivgak proved to be particularly generous with his knowledge, inviting Daniel to help with maintenance work at the store, while sharing observations about polar bear behavior that couldn't be found in any textbook. "The old-timers say the bears are changing," Robert explained as they reorganized inventory in the store's cramped back room. "Climate change is affecting the ice patterns, which means the bears are having to adapt their hunting strategies. That makes them more unpredictable, more likely to investigate human settlements." Daniel found himself fascinated by these insights, which added layers of complexity to his understanding of Arctic ecology. "Have there been more encounters with bears in recent years?" he asked, genuinely curious about how climate change was affecting daily life in the village. Robert paused in his work, his expression growing more serious. "We've always had to be careful around bears," he said. "But yes, they're coming closer to the village more often, and they're staying longer when they do come. Last spring, we had a big male that spent almost a week investigating the dump site. Had to organize patrols to make sure no one wandered in that direction alone." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Tuzroy-Luke, a woman in her 50s who served as the village's health aide and maintained the community's communication systems. Her usually calm demeanor seemed slightly strained as she entered the store, stamping snow from her boots with more force than necessary. "Robert, we need to talk," she said, nodding politely to Daniel before turning her attention to the store owner. "I just got off the radio with the North Slope Borough Emergency Services. They're tracking a large male polar bear that's been moving along the coast toward our area. Fish and Wildlife says he's been acting aggressively, investigating campsites and cabins between here and Deadhorse." Robert's expression immediately grew more alert. "How far out?" he asked, already moving toward the store's radio equipment. "Maybe 15 miles as of this morning," Margaret replied, "but you know how fast they can cover ground when they want to. Could be much closer by now." She glanced at Daniel, her expression carrying the kind of protective concern that small communities develop toward visitors. "You staying close to the village center, young man?" Daniel nodded, though he felt a small thrill of excitement at the possibility of observing a polar bear in its natural habitat, even from a safe distance. "Of course," he said, "I wouldn't want to put anyone at risk by being careless." Robert and Margaret exchanged a look that suggested years of shared experience dealing with both wildlife and well-meaning outsiders who didn't fully grasp the realities of Arctic life. "Good," Robert said. "Because polar bears aren't like other wildlife. They don't just scavenge or hunt when they're hungry. They're curious, and that curiosity can be dangerous for humans." That evening, as Daniel sat in the Aknavigak's kitchen writing in his journal by the light of a kerosene lamp, he reflected on the complexity of the cultural exchange he was experiencing. His original plan had been to spend time in Kaktovik, learning about Inupiat spiritual traditions while sharing his own Christian faith. But he was discovering that the process was far more nuanced than he had anticipated. The villagers were polite and welcoming, but they also maintained a respectful distance that suggested they had experience with outsiders who arrived with more enthusiasm than understanding. Mary Aknavigak seemed to sense his thoughtfulness as she prepared tea at the stove. "You're thinking pretty hard over there," she said with gentle humor. "Something troubling you?" Daniel looked up from his journal, grateful for the opportunity to voice some of his uncertainties. "I suppose I'm realizing that I may have been naive about what this experience would be like," he said honestly. I came here hoping to share my faith and learn about yours, but I'm starting to understand that the relationship between outsiders and your community is more complicated than I realized." Mary nodded approvingly, clearly pleased by his willingness to acknowledge his own limitations. "Most people who come here arrive with ideas about what they're going to find," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "The smart ones figure out pretty quickly that they need to listen more than they talk. Sounds like you might be one of the smart ones." Thomas looked up from the weather radio he had been monitoring, his expression growing concerned. "Storm's definitely coming," he announced. "Weather Service is calling for sustained winds of 40 to 50 miles per hour, with gusts up to 70. Temperatures going to drop to -20, and that's before the wind chill factor." Daniel felt a flutter of unease at the forecast, though he tried to maintain his composure. The weather conditions Thomas described were more extreme than anything he had experienced during his previous mission trips, and he was beginning to appreciate why the villagers took meteorological warnings so seriously. "How long is it supposed to last?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Could be anywhere from 1 day to a week," Thomas replied. "Arctic storms are unpredictable. Best thing to do is make sure we have everything we need and then wait it out." He glanced at Daniel with an expression that mixed kindness with concern. "You picked an interesting time to visit the Arctic, son." The storm arrived with the kind of violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of human presence in the Arctic. Daniel woke on his 4th morning in Kaktovik to the sound of wind that howled like something alive and angry, rattling the windows of the Aknavigak house with such force that he briefly worried they might shatter. When he looked outside, he could see nothing but a wall of white that obliterated every familiar landmark, creating a world that seemed to exist entirely within the space of a few feet. Mary was already up, moving around the kitchen with the calm efficiency of someone who had weathered countless such storms. "Coffee's ready," she said as Daniel emerged from his room, still pulling on layers of clothing. "Thomas is out checking the generator and making sure our fuel supplies are secure." Daniel accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring its warmth as he tried to process the sheer intensity of the storm raging outside. "I've never experienced anything like this," he admitted, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the wind. "This is just the beginning," Mary replied matter-of-factly. "Weather radio says it's going to get worse before it gets better, but don't worry. We're well prepared, and this house has been through storms much worse than this one." As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas burst through the front door in a cloud of snow and frigid air, his parka and boots covered with ice that had formed during his brief time outside. "Generator's running fine," he announced, stamping his feet to restore circulation. "But visibility is down to about 3 feet. Nobody should be going anywhere for the next day or two." Daniel spent the storm-bound days reading, writing in his journal, and engaging in long conversations with his hosts about everything from traditional hunting techniques to the challenges of maintaining cultural identity in an increasingly connected world. Mary shared stories about her grandmother, who had lived through the transition from traditional nomadic life to permanent settlements, while Thomas described the evolution of whaling practices and the complex regulations that now govern subsistence hunting. "The old ways and the new ways don't always fit together easily," Mary explained as they sat around the kitchen table on the 2nd day of the storm. "But we've learned to adapt. That's how we've survived up here for thousands of years." Daniel found himself increasingly impressed by the sophistication of Inupiat culture and the depth of knowledge required to thrive in such a challenging environment. His journal entries during this period reflected a growing humility about his own role as a cultural visitor and a deeper appreciation for the complexity of cross-cultural exchange. On the 3rd morning, the storm finally began to weaken, though the wind continued to blow with enough force to create dangerous conditions for anyone venturing outside. Thomas monitored the weather radio constantly, waiting for the all-clear signal that would indicate it was safe to resume normal activities. "Storm's moving east," he announced over breakfast. "Should be clear enough by this afternoon for people to start moving around again. But there's going to be a lot of snow to deal with. Probably 3 or 4 feet of new accumulation." Daniel felt a mixture of relief and excitement at the prospect of finally being able to explore the post-storm landscape. He had been imagining the kind of pristine winter scenery that would await them once the weather cleared, and he was eager to experience the profound silence that he assumed would follow such an intense meteorological event. Sarah Kanguk arrived at the house shortly after lunch, her snowshoes allowing her to navigate the deep drifts that had accumulated around the village. "Thought I'd check on everyone," she said, as Mary welcomed her inside. "We've got some clean-up work to do around the village, and we could use extra hands if anyone's available." Daniel immediately volunteered to help, grateful for the opportunity to contribute something useful to the community that had welcomed him so generously. "I'd be happy to help with whatever needs to be done," he said, already reaching for his parka. "Good," Sarah replied. "We need to check on some of the elders who live alone, make sure their heating systems are working properly and that they have enough food and fuel. Also need to clear snow away from some of the emergency equipment stations around the village perimeter." As they prepared to venture outside, Thomas pulled Daniel aside for a brief conversation. "Remember what Robert told you about the polar bears," he said seriously. "Storms like this can disrupt their normal patterns, make them more likely to investigate human settlements. Stay with Sarah, don't wander off, and keep your eyes open." Daniel nodded, though part of him wondered if Thomas was being overly cautious. The storm had been so intense that it seemed unlikely any wildlife would be active so soon after its passage. Still, he respected the older man's experience and promised to follow all safety protocols. The post-storm landscape that greeted them outside was breathtakingly beautiful, with snow drifts sculpted into flowing organic shapes that seemed to transform the familiar village into something from a fairy tale. The air was crystal clear and so cold that it seemed to freeze the inside of Daniel's nostrils with each breath, but the sunshine was brilliant against the white expanse, creating a sense of renewal and possibility. They spent the afternoon moving from house to house, checking on elderly residents and helping with basic maintenance tasks that had been made necessary by the storm's intensity. Daniel found himself genuinely useful in this work, his youthful strength appreciated by villagers who needed help with tasks like shoveling snow away from doors and windows or hauling fuel containers from storage areas. As evening approached, Sarah suggested they make one final check of the emergency equipment stations that were positioned around the village's perimeter to provide shelter and communication capabilities for anyone caught outside during emergencies. "These stations could save someone's life," she explained, as they snowshoed toward the northernmost edge of the settlement. "We need to make sure the storm didn't damage them." The emergency station they were approaching consisted of a small, insulated shelter equipped with a radio, emergency supplies, and heating equipment. It was positioned about half a mile from the main village area, far enough to provide coverage for the hunting and fishing areas that villagers used regularly, but close enough to be reached quickly in case of emergency. Daniel found himself struck by the profound silence that surrounded them as they moved away from the village center. The storm had left behind a landscape that seemed to exist in a state of perfect crystalline suspension, with every surface covered in snow so fresh and undisturbed that their snowshoe tracks were the only signs of recent activity. The setting sun was beginning to paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the snow with an almost supernatural beauty. "It's incredible out here," he said to Sarah, pausing to appreciate the vista that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. I can understand why your people developed such a deep spiritual connection to this land. Sarah smiled, pleased by his evident appreciation for the landscape that had shaped her culture for millennia. The land teaches you things, she agreed. Patience, humility, respect for forces larger than yourself. City people often don't understand that the wilderness isn't just scenery. It's a living system that demands understanding and respect. They were approximately 100 yards from the emergency station when Sarah suddenly stopped, her body language shifting from relaxed to alert in an instant. Daniel, who had been following slightly behind her, nearly collided with her as she raised her hand in a gesture that clearly meant stop. "What is it?" he whispered, though he wasn't sure why he was whispering. Sarah didn't answer immediately, her experienced eyes scanning the landscape with the kind of systematic attention that Daniel was beginning to recognize as essential survival behavior in the Arctic. After a moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely, she pointed toward an area about 50 yards to their left, where the snow appeared to have been disturbed. "Tracks," she said quietly. "Fresh ones." Daniel followed her gaze and felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the distinctive round impressions that could only have been made by a very large animal moving across the snow. Even from a distance, the tracks appeared enormous, far larger than anything he had ever seen outside of a zoo. "Polar bear?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah nodded, her expression growing increasingly serious as she studied the track pattern. "Big male, probably the one Margaret mentioned yesterday, and these tracks are very fresh, made since the storm ended." Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and fear that seemed to heighten every sensation, from the cold air against his face to the sound of his own breathing. This was exactly the kind of wildlife encounter he had hoped to experience during his time in the Arctic, though he was beginning to understand that the reality was far more intense than his imagination had suggested. "What should we do?" he asked, deferring to Sarah's obviously superior knowledge of polar bear behavior. Sarah continued to study the tracks, her analysis revealing information that Daniel couldn't begin to interpret. "The tracks are moving away from the village," she said finally. "That's good. But we need to get back and report this to Robert and the others. They'll want to organize patrols and make sure everyone knows to be extra careful for the next few days." As they turned to head back toward the village, Daniel couldn't resist taking one more look at the tracks that marked the passage of one of the Arctic's most formidable predators. The sight filled him with a complex mixture of awe and unease that would stay with him for the remainder of his time in Kaktovik. "Have you ever actually seen a polar bear in the wild?" he asked Sarah as they began their return journey. "Several times," she replied, "usually from a safe distance. They're magnificent animals, but they're also incredibly dangerous. A big male like the one that made these tracks could weigh 800 to 1,000 pounds, and they can run faster than you might think. The old-timers always said that polar bears are the only animal that will hunt humans deliberately." Daniel absorbed this information soberly, his excitement about the tracks tempered by a growing appreciation for the seriousness of the situation. "Do you think it will come back toward the village?" Sarah shrugged, her expression suggesting that predicting polar bear behavior was not an exact science. "Depends on what it's looking for. If it's just passing through, following the ice edge or tracking seals, it probably won't bother with us. But if it's hungry or curious about human activity, it might investigate further." They made the rest of the journey back to the village in relative silence, both of them scanning the landscape with heightened awareness that Daniel found both exhausting and exhilarating. By the time they reached the Aknavigak house, the sun had set completely, leaving them to navigate by starlight and the warm glow emanating from the village's scattered windows. Thomas and Mary listened to Sarah's report about the bear tracks with the kind of serious attention that Daniel was learning to associate with any discussion of Arctic safety. "I'll call Robert on the radio," Thomas said immediately. "He'll want to organize a village meeting to make sure everyone knows about this." Within an hour, nearly half the village's adult population had gathered in the community center, a converted building that served multiple functions from town meetings to cultural celebrations. Robert Akivgak stood at the front of the room, using a large map to illustrate the location where the tracks had been found and discussing the implications for village safety protocols. "Based on the track size and pattern, we're dealing with the mature male, probably in the 800 to 900-pound range," Robert explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades studying polar bear behavior. Sarah and Daniel found the tracks about half a mile north of the village center, moving in an easterly direction. Margaret Tusroy-Luke raised her hand from the back of the room. "Should we be implementing the standard bear alert protocols?" she asked, referring to a set of safety measures that included increased radio communication, organized patrols, and restrictions on individual movement outside the village perimeter. Robert nodded. "I think that would be wise, at least for the next few days. This bear might just be passing through, but we can't take any chances. No one should be going out alone, especially not in the areas north and east of the village where the tracks were found." Daniel found himself impressed by the systematic way the community responded to the potential threat, with various residents volunteering for patrol duties and communication responsibilities. The meeting concluded with a clear understanding of the safety protocols that would remain in effect until the bear had moved safely away from the area. As they walked back to the Aknavigak house after the meeting, Daniel reflected on how the discovery of the bear tracks had transformed his perception of the Arctic environment. What had seemed like a peaceful, beautiful landscape just a few hours earlier now felt charged with potential danger. Every shadow and snow drift representing a possible hiding place for a predator that could appear with little warning. "You handled that well today," Mary said as they prepared for bed. "A lot of visitors get either too excited or too frightened when they hear about bears. You seem to understand the importance of taking it seriously without panicking." Daniel appreciated the compliment, though he wasn't entirely sure how he had managed to appear calm when his mind was racing with thoughts about the enormous predator that was somewhere in the darkness beyond the village lights. "I have to admit, it's a lot more intense than I expected," he said honestly. "Reading about polar bears and actually knowing one is nearby are very different experiences." Thomas looked up from the weather radio he had been monitoring. "The key is respecting them without letting fear control your behavior," he said. "Polar bears are dangerous, but they're also predictable in certain ways. As long as we follow the safety protocols and stay alert, we should be fine." That night, Daniel lay in bed listening to the sounds of the Arctic night, which seemed far more ominous now that he knew a polar bear was somewhere in the vicinity. Every sound, the settling of the house, the distant howl of wind, the crack of ice adjusting to temperature changes, seemed potentially significant. Sleep came slowly, and when it did come, it was filled with dreams of enormous white shapes moving through pristine snow. He woke the next morning to find that his perspective on his Arctic experience had fundamentally shifted. Where he had previously seen beauty and spiritual possibility, he now also saw danger and the constant necessity of vigilance. It wasn't that he felt unsafe. The village's safety protocols were clearly well developed and effective, but rather that he had gained a new appreciation for the complexity of life in an environment where humans were not automatically at the top of the food chain. Sarah arrived after breakfast with news that the overnight patrols had not detected any further sign of bear activity near the village. "The tracks Robert and I found yesterday evening suggest the bear continued moving east along the coast," she reported. but we're going to maintain the safety protocols for at least another day or two." Daniel nodded, though he found himself slightly disappointed that the bear had apparently moved on without providing an opportunity for observation from a safe distance. "Is there any chance we might see it again?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Sarah and Thomas exchanged a look that suggested they had recognized the mixture of excitement and naivety that characterized many visitors' reactions to Arctic wildlife. "Polar bears are pretty unpredictable," Sarah said diplomatically. "It's possible this one could circle back, or we might encounter it if we're doing any traveling outside the village. But remember, seeing a polar bear in the wild isn't like watching a nature documentary. These are serious predators, and encounters with humans don't always end well." The warning was gentle but unmistakable, and Daniel felt slightly embarrassed by his obvious enthusiasm for what the villagers clearly considered a genuine safety concern. "Of course," he said. "I understand the danger. I just meant that it would be an incredible experience to observe one from a safe distance." "The safest distance is usually about 10 miles, Thomas said with dry humor. "But I understand what you mean. There's something about polar bears that captures people's imagination. Just remember that your imagination and reality don't always match up." Over the next 2 days, Daniel threw himself into village activities with renewed energy, helping with maintenance projects, participating in cultural discussions, and continuing his journal writing. The knowledge that a polar bear had recently passed through the area added an extra dimension of intensity to every outdoor activity, making him more aware of his surroundings and more appreciative of the expertise that allowed the villagers to live safely in such a challenging environment. On the 6th day of his stay, Daniel woke to find that his time in Kaktovik was rapidly approaching its planned conclusion. His return flight was scheduled for the following afternoon, weather permitting, and he realized that he had not yet accomplished one of his original goals, spending time alone in the Arctic wilderness for personal reflection and spiritual contemplation. The idea had been central to his vision of this mission trip, time spent in solitude, surrounded by the profound silence and beauty of the Arctic landscape, seeking the kind of spiritual insight that he believed could only come from such an experience. The bear alert had disrupted those plans, but as he lay in bed watching the early morning light filter through the frost-covered windows, he found himself reconsidering the possibility. The bear tracks were now 3 days old, and the overnight patrols had detected no fresh sign of bear activity in the area. Weather conditions were excellent, with clear skies and minimal wind that would provide ideal conditions for a short excursion outside the village perimeter. If he stayed relatively close to the settlement and maintained radio contact, surely a few hours of solitary reflection would be safe enough. Daniel spent the morning helping Thomas with routine maintenance work around the house, while privately developing his plan for an afternoon walk. He would follow one of the established trails that led toward the traditional fishing areas north of the village, staying within radio range and returning well before dark. The route would take him through some of the most beautiful landscape he had encountered during his stay, and the solitude would provide the spiritual experience he had been seeking. During lunch, he casually mentioned his plan to Mary and Thomas, presenting it as a short afternoon walk rather than the extended solo expedition he had originally envisioned. "I was thinking I might take a walk this afternoon," he said, trying to keep his tone conversational. "Maybe follow the trail toward the fishing area for an hour or two. I'd stay in radio contact, of course." Mary and Thomas exchanged a concerned look that Daniel pretended not to notice. "The bear alert is still in effect," Mary said gently. "Robert specifically asked that no one go out alone until we're sure the bear has moved out of the area completely." "I understand the concern," Daniel replied, "but the tracks are 3 days old now, and the patrols haven't found any fresh sign." I'd only be gone for a couple of hours, and I'd have the radio with me the whole time. Thomas set down his coffee cup with a deliberate motion that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. Son, I know you're eager to experience the Arctic wilderness, but this isn't the time to be taking unnecessary risks. That bear could be anywhere, and polar bears don't always leave obvious tracks when they're moving across hard-packed snow. Daniel felt a flash of frustration at what seemed like excessive caution, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. I appreciate your concern, he said, but I'm not planning to go very far. Just a short walk to experience the landscape and do some thinking before I have to leave tomorrow. Mary leaned forward, her expression combining kindness with unmistakable firmness. Daniel, we've grown fond of you during your stay here, and we want you to go home safely. The Arctic can be unforgiving, especially for people who don't have years of experience reading the signs. Please reconsider this plan. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah, who had come to discuss logistics for Daniel's departure flight the following day. When she heard about his proposed afternoon walk, her reaction was immediate and unambiguous. "Absolutely not," she said, her voice carrying an authority that Daniel had not heard from her before. "The bear alert is still in effect, and even if it wasn't, going out alone would be inadvisable for someone with your level of Arctic experience." Daniel felt his frustration mounting, though he tried to maintain a respectful tone. "I understand everyone's concerns, but I'm not planning to do anything reckless. I just want a few hours of solitude before I have to leave. Surely that's not unreasonable." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her position remained firm. "Daniel, I know this is disappointing, but you have to understand that our safety protocols exist for good reasons. Every year, we hear about experienced outdoors people who thought they could handle the Arctic on their own and ended up in serious trouble. You're a guest in our community, and we take responsibility for your safety seriously." The discussion continued for several more minutes, with Daniel growing increasingly frustrated by what he perceived as excessive caution, and the villagers maintaining their position with polite but absolute firmness. Finally, recognizing that he was not going to convince them to approve his plan, Daniel excused himself and went to his room to think. As he sat on his bed, reviewing his options, Daniel found himself torn between respect for his host's concerns and disappointment at the prospect of leaving the Arctic without the solitary spiritual experience that had been central to his vision for this trip. The rational part of his mind acknowledged that the villagers' caution was probably justified, but another part of him wondered if they were being overly protective of someone who was, after all, an adult capable of making his own decisions. After an hour of internal debate, Daniel reached a decision that he knew his hosts would not approve, but that felt necessary for the completion of his mission. He would take a short walk alone, but he would be extremely careful about it. He would stay close to the village, follow established trails, maintain regular radio contact, and return before dark. The risk seemed minimal, and the potential spiritual benefit felt essential. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, while Mary was visiting neighbors and Thomas was napping, Daniel quietly gathered his winter gear and slipped out of the house. He left a note explaining his plans and emphasizing that he would be back before dark, then set off toward the trail that led to the traditional fishing areas north of the village. The afternoon was spectacularly beautiful, with brilliant sunshine and virtually no wind, creating ideal conditions for outdoor activity. The snow crunched satisfyingly under his boots as he walked, and the profound silence of the Arctic landscape was everything he had hoped it would be. For the first time since arriving in Kaktovik, Daniel felt the kind of spiritual connection to the natural world that had motivated his journey to this remote corner of Alaska. He followed the established trail for approximately 45 minutes, pausing frequently to appreciate the scenery and to check in via radio with the village. His periodic reports to Sarah were brief and professional, confirming his location and status without revealing the full extent of his plan to continue walking until he found the perfect spot for extended reflection. At approximately 3:15, Daniel reached a small rise that offered panoramic views of the surrounding landscape stretching away toward the Beaufort Sea. The vista was breathtaking, with the low Arctic sun casting long shadows across the snow that created an almost ethereal quality of light. This, he decided, was exactly the kind of setting he had been seeking for his spiritual contemplation. He established a small camp of sorts, using his pack as a seat and arranging his supplies within easy reach. The radio remained clipped to his belt, and he made his scheduled check-in call to confirm his continued safety. Sarah's voice sounded slightly strained when she responded, suggesting that news of his unauthorized expedition had reached the village, but she limited herself to reminding him to maintain regular contact and to start heading back no later than 4 o'clock. Daniel settled into his meditation with a sense of satisfaction at finally achieving the solitary Arctic experience he had envisioned. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional distant sound of wind across the ice, or the subtle creaking of snow settling in the cold. The spiritual connection he felt to this vast, pristine landscape was everything he had hoped it would be, and he found himself filled with gratitude for the opportunity to experience such transcendent beauty. He had been sitting in contemplation for approximately 20 minutes when he became aware of a sound that seemed somehow different from the natural background noise of the Arctic environment. At first, he dismissed it as wind or the normal settling sounds of ice and snow, but as it continued, he began to pay closer attention. The sound was rhythmic and seemed to be growing gradually closer, though its direction was difficult to determine in the vast, open landscape. Daniel found himself straining to identify what he was hearing, his peaceful meditation replaced by a growing sense of alertness that he couldn't quite explain. When he finally saw the source of the sound, his first reaction was not fear but wonder. The polar bear was approximately 300 yards away, moving across the snow with the kind of purposeful gait that suggested it had a specific destination in mind. It was enormous, far larger than Daniel had imagined even after seeing the tracks, and its movement across the landscape had a fluid, almost hypnotic quality that was mesmerizing to watch. For a moment, Daniel simply sat and observed, filled with awe at the sight of one of the Arctic's most magnificent predators in its natural habitat. The bear appeared to be following a route that would take it well clear of Daniel's position, and he felt incredibly fortunate to be witnessing such a spectacular example of Arctic wildlife from what seemed like a safe distance. It was only when the bear suddenly stopped and turned in his direction that Daniel began to feel the first stirrings of unease. The massive head swung slowly as the animal tested the air, its black nose searching for scents that might provide information about its surroundings. For several long moments, predator and human remained motionless, separated by 300 yards of pristine snow. Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward the radio, clipped to his belt, though he hesitated to make any sudden movements that might attract the bear's attention. His mind raced through everything he had read about polar bear behavior, trying to remember the recommended protocols for such an encounter. Stay calm, avoid sudden movements, back away slowly if possible, make noise to identify yourself as human. The bear took several steps in Daniel's direction, then stopped again, its massive head tilted as if listening for sounds that might help it understand what it was investigating. Daniel found himself holding his breath, acutely aware that he was observing a predator that was quite capable of covering the distance between them in a matter of seconds if it chose to do so. Very slowly, Daniel reached for his radio, keeping his movements as deliberate and non-threatening as possible. When he keyed the microphone, his voice was steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through his system. "Sarah, this is Daniel," he said quietly. "I've got a polar bear in sight, approximately 300 yards away. It appears to be aware of my presence." The response was immediate and tense. "Daniel, maintain your position and do not make any sudden movements. We're organizing a response team now. Can you describe the bear's behavior?" Daniel kept his eyes on the massive animal as he replied, "It's a very large male, just like you described. It was moving east along what looks like a game trail, but it stopped when it detected me. Right now it's just standing and observing." "Is it showing any aggressive behavior?" "Approaching your position?" Daniel watched as the bear took several more steps in his direction, then stopped again. The distance between them had closed to perhaps 250 yards, and he could now clearly see the powerful muscles beneath the thick white fur, the small dark eyes that seemed to be evaluating him with intelligent consideration. "It's moved a little closer," Daniel reported, working to keep his voice calm. "Maybe 50 yards, but it's not rushing or showing obvious aggression. It seems curious more than anything else." Sarah's voice crackled through the radio with increasing urgency. "Daniel, you need to start backing away very slowly. Do not turn your back on the bear and do not run. We have a team heading out to your location, but it's going to take us at least 20 minutes to reach you." Daniel began to comply with Sarah's instructions, rising slowly from his seated position and taking small, deliberate steps backward. The bear watched his movements with what appeared to be intense interest, tilting its massive head from side to side as if trying to determine what kind of creature it was observing. For several minutes, the situation remained relatively stable, with Daniel backing away slowly, while the bear maintained its distance and continued to observe. Daniel found himself marveling at the animal's size and power, even as he recognized the serious danger of his situation. The bear's shoulders were massive, its paws enormous, and its overall presence radiated a kind of primal authority that no amount of reading could have prepared him for. The dynamics of the encounter changed abruptly when the bear suddenly dropped to all fours and began moving directly toward Daniel's position. The animal's gait was purposeful but not yet aggressive, more like an investigation than an attack, but the closing distance triggered every survival instinct Daniel possessed. "Sarah, the bear is approaching," Daniel said into the radio, his voice tight with controlled fear. "It's moving directly toward me." "How far away is it now?" Daniel estimated the distance as quickly as he could while continuing to back away. "Maybe 150 yards and closing. It's not running, but it's definitely coming this way." "Keep backing away, but do not run," Sarah's voice commanded. "Make yourself appear as large as possible. If you have any noise-making devices, use them to identify yourself as human." Daniel continued his slow retreat while searching his pack for anything that might serve as a noisemaker. The best he could find was a metal water bottle, which he began to tap against his hiking pole while calling out in a loud, clear voice that he hoped would identify him as human rather than prey. The bear paused at the sound, tilting its head with apparent curiosity. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to hope that the noise had served its intended purpose of causing the animal to lose interest and move away. Instead, after a brief hesitation, the bear resumed its approach with what appeared to be increased determination. "It's getting closer," Daniel reported, estimating the distance at approximately 100 yards. The noise didn't scare it off. Sarah's response carried a note of controlled panic that Daniel had not heard from her before. "Daniel, if that bear continues to approach, you may need to use bear spray or other defensive measures. Do you have any deterrents with you?" Daniel felt a sinking sensation as he realized that he had not brought bear spray or any other wildlife deterrents on what he had planned as a brief spiritual retreat. The oversight now seemed criminally naive, and he cursed himself for the poor planning that had put him in such a dangerous situation. "Negative on the bear spray," he reported, working to keep his voice steady. "I don't have any deterrents with me." The silence that followed his report seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the soft crunch of snow as he continued his retreat. When Sarah's voice returned, it carried a grim determination that confirmed the seriousness of his situation. "Daniel, listen to me very carefully. Our response team is still at least 15 minutes away. You need to continue backing away, but if that bear closes to within 50 yards, you may need to consider other options. Look around you. Are there any elevated positions or obstacles that might provide protection?" Daniel scanned his surroundings quickly, though he had to divide his attention between the approaching bear and his search for potential refuge. The landscape around him was frustratingly open, with only a few scattered boulders and small rises that would provide minimal protection against a determined polar bear. "There's not much here," he reported. "Some rocks about 50 yards behind me, but nothing that would really stop a bear if it wanted to get at me." The bear continued its steady approach, now close enough that Daniel could see individual details of its appearance. The yellowish tinge to its fur, the massive claws that left deep impressions in the snow, the intelligent dark eyes that seemed to be studying him with predatory calculation. The animal's size was overwhelming, far larger than any bear Daniel had ever seen in captivity, and its movement across the snow demonstrated the kind of power and agility that made polar bears the Arctic's apex predator. "Distance is maybe 75 yards now," Daniel reported, his voice beginning to betray the fear that he was working so hard to control. "It's still coming." "Keep backing away," Sarah instructed, though Daniel could hear the strain in her voice. "Our team is moving as fast as they can, but the snow conditions are slowing them down. You're going to have to hold that bear off for at least another 10 minutes. 10 minutes seemed like an eternity as Daniel continued his retreat, while watching the massive predator close the distance between them with inexorable determination. The bear's approach was methodical rather than rushed, suggesting a level of intelligence and calculation that made the situation even more terrifying. This was not an animal acting on blind instinct, but a sophisticated predator that was evaluating its options and planning its next move. At approximately 60 yards, the bear stopped again, rising up on its hind legs to gain a better view of the strange creature it had been tracking. Standing upright, the animal was even more imposing, easily 9 feet tall and radiating the kind of raw power that left no doubt about its position at the top of the Arctic food chain. For several long moments, bear and human regarded each other across the expanse of white snow, each trying to understand the intentions of the other. "It's standing up," Daniel reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe 9 feet tall. I can see it breathing." "That's investigative behavior," Sarah replied, her voice carrying forced calm. "It's trying to get a better look at you and figure out what you are. Just keep backing away slowly and avoid making any sudden movements." The bear dropped back to all fours and resumed its approach, though its pace had slowed somewhat. Daniel found himself backing toward the cluster of rocks he had identified earlier, though he was increasingly doubtful that they would provide any meaningful protection if the animal decided to attack. His retreat was hampered by the deep snow and his own growing exhaustion, and he realized that he could not continue backing away indefinitely. 50 yards, he reported, his voice tight with tension. "I'm almost to those rocks I mentioned." "Good," Sarah responded. "Get behind them if you can, but don't make any sudden movements. And Daniel, if that bear charges, do not try to run. Play dead, lie face down, protect your neck and head, and do not move no matter what happens." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature as he absorbed Sarah's instructions. The prospect of lying motionless while a 1,000-pound predator investigated him was terrifying, but he understood that running would only trigger the bear's chase instinct and guarantee a fatal outcome. He reached the rocks and carefully positioned himself behind the largest boulder, which was approximately 4 feet high and might provide some minimal protection. The bear watched his movements with apparent interest, tilting its massive head as if trying to understand what the strange creature was doing. "I'm behind the rocks now," Daniel reported. "The bear is maybe 40 yards away and watching me." "Stay where you are," Sarah instructed. "Our team should be able to see you soon. They're carrying flares and other deterrents that might be able to drive the bear away." Daniel crouched behind the boulder, acutely aware that his position provided only the illusion of safety. If the bear decided to investigate further, the rocks would pose no significant obstacle to an animal capable of killing seals through 3 feet of ice. His heart was pounding so hard that he could hear it over the sound of his own breathing, and his hands were shaking despite the thick gloves he wore. The bear remained stationary for several more minutes, apparently content to observe Daniel from its current position. During this lull, Daniel found himself studying the animal with a mixture of terror and fascination. Even in his current predicament, he could not help but appreciate the magnificent beauty of the creature. Its perfect adaptation to the Arctic environment, the fluid grace of its movements, the intelligence evident in its behavior. The temporary standoff was broken when the bear suddenly began moving again, this time approaching Daniel's position with more obvious intent. The animal's body language had changed subtly, its movements becoming more purposeful and predatory. Daniel felt his mouth go dry as he realized that the bear's investigative phase was apparently over, and it was now treating him as either prey or a threat that needed to be dealt with. "It's coming again," Daniel reported, his voice cracking slightly. "Maybe 30 yards now, and it looks more aggressive." "Hold your position," Sarah commanded. "Our team is almost there. Just a few more minutes." Daniel pressed himself against the boulder, trying to make himself as small and non-threatening as possible, while the massive predator closed the distance between them. At 20 yards, he could hear the bear's breathing, a rhythmic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the Arctic silence. At 15 yards, he could see the individual whiskers on its muzzle, and the way its small, dark eyes seemed to focus directly on him with predatory intent. The bear stopped at approximately 10 yards, close enough that Daniel could smell its musky scent and see the vapor clouds formed by its breath in the cold air. The animal was enormous from this distance, its shoulders broader than Daniel's entire body, its paws larger than dinner plates. Every detail of its appearance spoke of power and predatory efficiency that had been refined through millions of years of evolution. For several long moments, predator and prey remained frozen in a tableau that seemed to exist outside of normal time. Daniel found himself holding his breath, afraid that even the sound of his breathing might provoke an attack. The bear studied him with obvious intelligence, its head tilting from side to side, as if trying to determine exactly what kind of creature it had cornered. The attack, when it came, was sudden and explosive. The bear lunged forward with shocking speed, covering the remaining distance in a single bound that brought it to within arm's reach of Daniel's position. Daniel threw himself backward instinctively, his body moving before his mind could process what was happening. "Bear spray!" he shouted into the radio, though he knew he had no such weapon. "It's attacking!" The bear's first swipe missed Daniel by inches, its massive paw slamming into the boulder with enough force to send chips of rock flying. Daniel scrambled backward, abandoning his pack and radio in his desperate attempt to put distance between himself and the enraged predator. The animal's roar was deafening, a sound that seemed to come from some primal part of the world that existed before human civilization. Daniel managed to get to his feet and began running, his mind screaming that he should play dead, as Sarah had instructed, but his body refusing to stop moving in the face of imminent destruction. Behind him, he could hear the bear pursuing, its massive paws thundering against the snow as it closed the distance with terrifying speed. The chase lasted only seconds before Daniel felt the impact that sent him tumbling across the snow like a rag doll. The bear's paw had caught him in the back, its claws tearing through his heavy parka as if it were tissue paper. Daniel hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs and filling his mouth with snow and blood. Dimly, he remembered Sarah's instructions about playing dead. He forced himself to lie motionless, face down in the snow, his hands protecting his neck and head, while every instinct screamed at him to keep running. The bear's breath was hot against his neck as the massive predator investigated this strange prey that had suddenly stopped moving. The first bite was experimental, the bear's massive jaws closing gently around Daniel's shoulder, as if testing the texture and flavor of its potential meal. Daniel bit down on his own tongue to keep from screaming, tasting blood as he fought against every survival instinct his body possessed. The bear's teeth were like railroad spikes, easily penetrating his clothing and flesh, but the pressure was almost gentle, as if the animal was still deciding whether this strange creature was actually food. Through the haze of pain and terror, Daniel could hear voices in the distance, human shouts that seemed impossibly far away, but that represented his only hope of survival. The bear heard them too, lifting its massive head to scan the horizon for the source of this new disturbance. For a moment, the pressure on Daniel's shoulder eased, and he dared to hope that rescue was imminent. The hope was short-lived. The bear apparently decided that human voices in the distance were less important than the meal it had already secured. The gentle, experimental bite became something far more serious as the animal's jaws closed with crushing force around Daniel's shoulder and upper arm. This time, Daniel could not suppress the scream that tore from his throat, a sound of pure agony that seemed to encourage the bear's feeding behavior. The rescue team, led by Robert Akivgak and including Sarah and 3 other experienced hunters, crested the rise at a distance of approximately 200 yards, just as the bear's attack intensified. The sight that greeted them was every Arctic resident's worst nightmare, a massive polar bear actively feeding on a human victim who was still clearly alive and conscious. Robert immediately fired a signal flare directly at the bear, the bright red projectile streaking across the snow and exploding in a shower of sparks near the animal's head. The bear startled at the sudden noise and light, releasing its grip on Daniel and backing away several steps while scanning for the source of this new threat. "Again!" Sarah shouted, and Robert fired a second flare, this one striking the ground even closer to the bear's position. The animal roared its displeasure at these interruptions, but showed no signs of abandoning its meal. Sarah and 2 other team members began a coordinated advance toward the attack site, shouting at the tops of their voices while banging metal objects together to create as much noise as possible. The remaining team member, equipped with the group's only rifle, took up a position that would allow for a clear shot if the deterrent tactics failed. The bear remained protective of its meal, standing over Daniel's motionless form while issuing deep growls of warning toward the approaching humans. Blood stained the snow around Daniel's body, and his lack of movement suggested that he might already be dead, though the rescue team could not be certain from their current distance. "We need to get closer," Sarah called to Robert, though both of them understood the enormous risk involved in approaching an actively feeding polar bear. "If he's still alive, we don't have much time." Robert nodded grimly, checking his remaining flares while calculating the odds of successfully driving off an 800-pound predator that had already committed to its meal. "On my signal, we all advance together. Make as much noise as possible. If it charges, everyone scatter except Tom. He'll have one chance for a clean shot." The coordinated advance began with the four rescuers moving forward in a line, creating a cacophony of shouting and metal banging that echoed across the Arctic landscape. The bear responded with increased agitation, rearing up on its hind legs to better assess this new threat while maintaining its position over Daniel's prone form. At 50 yards, Robert fired his third flare directly at the bear's chest, the projectile striking the animal and causing it to stagger backward with a roar of pain and rage. The bear dropped to all fours and took several aggressive steps toward the rescue team, its massive head lowered in a threatening posture that suggested it was preparing to charge. Tom, the team member with the rifle, took careful aim at the approaching predator, knowing that he would have only one opportunity to stop a charging polar bear. His finger tightened on the trigger as the massive animal advanced to within 30 yards of their position. The shot, when it came, was perfectly placed, striking the bear in the chest and dropping it immediately to the snow. The animal struggled briefly, attempting to rise despite its mortal wound, then collapsed and lay still, its massive bulk settling into the snow with a finality that marked the end of one of the Arctic's most magnificent predators. The silence that followed the gunshot seemed profound after the chaos of the preceding minutes. Sarah was the first to move, racing toward Daniel's motionless form, while the other team members maintained watch for any additional bears that might be attracted to the commotion. Daniel was unconscious, but breathing when Sarah reached him, his body broken and bloodied, but showing signs of life that filled the rescue team with cautious hope. His shoulder and upper arm had been severely mauled, his heavy clothing shredded and soaked with blood, but his vital signs were stable enough to suggest that survival was possible if they could get him to medical care quickly. "He's alive!" Sarah called to the others, her voice carrying relief mixed with urgency. "But we need to get him to the medical station immediately. His shoulder is badly damaged and he's lost a lot of blood." The rescue team worked with practiced efficiency to stabilize Daniel for transport, using emergency medical supplies to control bleeding and prevent shock while preparing to carry him back to the village. The sled they had brought for this purpose proved essential, allowing them to move their patient quickly across the snow without exacerbating his injuries. Margaret Tusroyluk had already prepared the village's medical station for trauma treatment, converting the small clinic into an emergency room equipped with IV fluids, pain medication, and the other supplies needed to stabilize a severe mauling victim. Her training as a health aide had included preparation for exactly this type of emergency, though she had hoped never to use those skills. Daniel regained consciousness during the transport back to the village, his awareness returning gradually through a haze of pain medication and shock. His first conscious memory was of Sarah's voice reassuring him that he was safe and that medical help was available, though the details remained fuzzy for hours afterward. The initial medical assessment revealed the extent of Daniel's injuries to be severe, but not immediately life-threatening. The bear's attack had resulted in massive tissue damage to his left shoulder and upper arm, multiple deep puncture wounds from the animal's teeth, and significant blood loss that had been controlled through field treatment. His survival was due largely to the quick response of the rescue team and his own decision to play dead rather than continue running. Margaret worked through the night to stabilize Daniel's condition, administering IV fluids to combat shock, antibiotics to prevent infection, and pain medication to manage the trauma from his injuries. The village's satellite communication system allowed her to consult with trauma specialists in Anchorage, who provided guidance on treatment protocols for polar bear attacks. "You're incredibly lucky," Margaret told Daniel during one of his periods of lucidity. "That bear could have killed you in seconds if it had wanted to. The fact that you survived suggests it was more curious than hungry when it first approached you." Daniel's memories of the attack remained fragmentary for days afterward, though certain details were etched in his mind with crystalline clarity. The bear's enormous size, The intelligence in its dark eyes, the crushing power of its jaws when it decided to investigate him as potential prey. The psychological trauma of the encounter would prove to be as significant as the physical injuries, requiring months of counseling and therapy to address. The death of the polar bear that had attacked Daniel created its own set of complications for the village and the rescue team. Polar bears are protected under both federal and international law, and the killing of one, even in defense of human life, required extensive documentation and investigation by multiple agencies. Fish and Wildlife Service investigators arrived within days to examine the attack site, interview witnesses, and determine whether the shooting had been justified under the regulations governing human-bear conflicts. Robert Arkivgak, as the team leader who had authorized the shooting, faced the most scrutiny during the investigation. His decades of experience with polar bear behavior and his reputation within the community ultimately supported the determination that the killing had been necessary to save Daniel's life. But the process was lengthy and stressful for everyone involved. The media attention that followed Daniel's attack was intense, but complicated by the remote location and the complex cultural dynamics of the situation. Environmental groups questioned whether proper precautions had been taken to avoid the conflict, while others used the incident to highlight the challenges faced by Arctic communities dealing with changing polar bear behavior patterns related to climate change. Daniel's recovery process extended far beyond the initial medical treatment, requiring multiple surgeries to repair the damage to his shoulder and arm, extensive physical therapy to restore function to the injured limb, and psychological counseling to address the trauma of his near-death experience. The support he received from the Kaktovik community was overwhelming, with villagers taking turns visiting him during his hospital stay in Anchorage and maintaining contact throughout his recovery. The spiritual implications of his Arctic experience were complex and took months to fully process. Daniel had gone to Kaktovik seeking a profound connection with the natural world and a deeper understanding of his own faith. And in some ways, he had achieved those goals, though not in the manner he had anticipated. His encounter with the polar bear had provided him with insights into the nature of mortality, the interconnectedness of all living things, and the humility required to exist as part of, rather than master of, the natural world. The village of Kaktovik incorporated Daniel's attack into their ongoing education efforts about polar bear safety, using his experience as a case study in the importance of following established protocols when living in bear country. The incident also led to enhanced safety measures for visitors, including mandatory briefings on polar bear behavior and requirements for radio communication and check-in procedures. Daniel eventually returned to his work as a missionary, though his approach to cross-cultural engagement had been fundamentally altered by his Arctic experience. The humility he had gained from his encounter with forces beyond human control informed all of his subsequent work, making him a more effective and culturally sensitive representative of his faith community. The polar bear that had attacked him was later determined through necropsy examination to have been a mature male in good physical condition, approximately 12 years old and weighing just over 800 pounds. Analysis of its stomach contents revealed that it had not eaten recently, which may have contributed to its willingness to investigate Daniel as potential prey. The animal's death was mourned by the Kaktovik community, which viewed polar bears as an essential part of their cultural and spiritual identity. Years later, Daniel would return to Alaska several times, though always as part of organized groups and never alone in the wilderness. His respect for the Arctic environment and its magnificent predators had deepened rather than diminished as a result of his experience, and he became an advocate for conservation efforts aimed at protecting polar bear habitat in the face of climate change. The lessons learned from Daniel's attack contributed to improved safety protocols for missionaries, researchers, and other visitors to Arctic communities, potentially preventing similar incidents in the future. His willingness to share his story, despite the personal difficulty of reliving the trauma, helped educate others about the realities of life in polar bear country and the importance of respecting the power and unpredictability of these magnificent predators. The Arctic landscape, where Daniel had nearly lost his life, continued to change in the years following his attack, with shifting ice patterns and warming temperatures altering the behavior patterns of polar bears and other wildlife. The challenges faced by communities like Kaktovik in adapting to these changes while maintaining their traditional connections to the land served as a microcosm for the broader environmental challenges facing the Arctic region. Daniel's Bible, which had been left behind during his flight from the attacking bear, was eventually recovered from the attack site and returned to him during his recovery. The blood-stained pages served as a powerful reminder of his experience and became a central element in his subsequent ministry work, symbolizing both the fragility of human life and the possibility of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of Daniel's attack and survival became part of the oral tradition of Kaktovik, joining the countless other stories of human encounters with polar bears that had shaped the community's understanding of their relationship with these powerful predators. For a culture that had coexisted with polar bears for thousands of years, Daniel's experience was both exceptional in its outcome and familiar in its demonstration of the constant vigilance required to live safely in bear country. The investigation into the attack ultimately concluded that no safety protocols had been violated by the village or the rescue team, though Daniel's decision to venture out alone, despite warnings, was noted as a contributing factor. The report recommended enhanced safety briefings for visitors and improved communication protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. Margaret Tazroy-Luke received recognition from state and federal agencies for her role in saving Daniel's life, her quick medical response being credited as essential to his survival. The experience also led to improvements in the medical supplies and communication equipment available to remote health aides throughout Alaska, potentially benefiting future victims of wilderness trauma. Sarah Kanguk continued her work as a cultural liaison and educator, using Daniel's experience as a powerful example in her discussions with visitors about the importance of respecting Arctic wildlife and following safety protocols. Her role in coordinating the rescue effort enhanced her reputation within the community and led to her appointment to regional committees dealing with human-wildlife conflicts. The attack site itself was avoided by villagers for several months following the incident, though it eventually returned to normal use as a hunting and fishing area. The location was marked with a small cairn that served as both a memorial to the polar bear that had died there and a reminder of the importance of vigilance when traveling in bear country. Daniel's recovery progressed slowly but steadily over the course of 2 years, with full function eventually returning to his injured arm and shoulder. The visible scars from the attack served as permanent reminders of his experience, though they also became symbols of survival and resilience that inspired others facing their own challenges. The polar bear population in the region continued to be monitored closely by wildlife biologists, with Daniel's attack being incorporated into long-term studies of human-bear interactions in the Arctic. The data contributed to improved understanding of the factors that lead to aggressive encounters and helped inform management strategies aimed at reducing such conflicts. Years after his attack, Daniel would write extensively about his Arctic experience, producing articles and eventually a book that explored the spiritual dimensions of his encounter with one of nature's most powerful predators. His writing helped readers understand both the beauty and the danger of the Arctic environment, while emphasizing the importance of approaching wilderness areas with proper preparation and respect. The village of Kaktovik continued to welcome visitors while implementing the enhanced safety measures that had grown out of Daniel's experience. The community's commitment to sharing their culture and knowledge with outsiders remained strong, though it was now tempered by an even greater emphasis on the responsibility that both hosts and guests bore for ensuring everyone's safety in one of the world's most challenging environments. The next stories: Grizzly Attacks, Wilderness Training Group during Night Hike, July 8, 2024. The morning of July 6, 2024, dawned crisp and clear over the Bitterroot Range in northwestern Montana, the kind of pristine wilderness morning that draws outdoor enthusiasts from across the country to test themselves against nature's most unforgiving terrain. Daniel Marcus Price, a 43-year-old former Marine and certified wilderness survival instructor, stood at the edge of the trailhead parking area at mile marker 47 on Highway 93, breathing in the thin mountain air and surveying the group of 15 adults who had paid substantial fees to spend a week learning advanced wilderness survival techniques under his guidance. Daniel had been running Mountain Forge survival training for 8 years, ever since his discharge from the Marines after 2 tours in Afghanistan left him with a Purple Heart, a titanium rod in his left leg, and an unshakable need to be surrounded by the honest brutality of the wilderness rather than the complex moral ambiguities of urban life. His reputation in the outdoor survival community was sterling. Graduates of his programs regularly went on to become search and rescue volunteers, wilderness guides, and survival instructors themselves. His waiting list stretched 18 months, and his alumni included doctors, lawyers, teachers, and even a few celebrities who craved the authenticity of genuine hardship in an increasingly sanitized world. The group assembled before him represented a typical cross-section of his clientele. Rebecca Chen, 35, was a trauma surgeon from Seattle who had signed up after losing a patient in a hiking accident, determined to never again feel helpless in a wilderness emergency. Her petite frame belied a fierce competitiveness that had driven her through medical school and surgical residency. Standing beside her, Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old software engineer from Portland, had grown soft behind a desk and was desperately seeking to reconnect with something primal and real. His pale complexion and nervous energy marked him as someone more comfortable with code than terrain. Jennifer Martinez, 41, was a single mother and high school biology teacher from Denver who had saved for 3 years to afford this expedition. Her 17-year-old daughter was spending the week with her father, and Jennifer saw this as perhaps her last chance for this kind of adventure before age and responsibility made such risks unthinkable. She had been an avid rock climber in college, but hadn't pushed herself physically in over a decade. Thomas Bear Kowalski, despite his nickname, was a gentle giant of 52 who worked as a union electrician in Chicago. At 6'4" and weighing close to 300 pounds, he looked formidable, but had never been in a real fight or faced genuine physical danger. His wife had died of cancer 2 years earlier, and he was using the insurance money to check items off a bucket list they had created together. Sarah Kim, 33, was a recently divorced accountant from Los Angeles who had discovered hiking as therapy during her messy separation and was now seeking to push her limits in more challenging terrain. The group also included David Rodriguez, a 39-year-old paramedic from Phoenix, whose work had shown him too many wilderness rescue scenarios gone wrong. He wanted to understand survival from the inside. Janet Stevens, 45, was a marketing executive from Boston who had climbed corporate ladders but never actual mountains, and saw this week as a chance to test herself outside the boardroom. Kevin Murphy, 34, was a park ranger from Yellowstone who wanted to expand his skills, while Lisa Wang, 29, was a nurse practitioner who specialized in emergency medicine and felt compelled to understand wilderness trauma treatment. Robert Bobby Harrison, 37, was a construction foreman from Dallas whose rough exterior concealed a deep love of nature photography. He had brought an expensive camera setup, despite Daniel's warnings about unnecessary gear. Michelle Torres, 32, was a police officer from Miami who had never experienced genuine wilderness, but felt drawn to test her tactical training in a natural environment. Amanda Foster, 38, was a yoga instructor from Santa Fe whose spiritual practice had led her to seek more challenging physical tests, while Gregory Palmer, 44, was a recently retired military officer transitioning to civilian life and struggling with the absence of structure and purpose. Finally, there was Jason Mitchell, 31, a freelance journalist from New York City who was researching an article about the growing popularity of extreme survival training among urban professionals. His presence made some of the others slightly self-conscious. Though Daniel had cleared his participation and Jason had signed the same liability waivers and paid the same fees as everyone else, Daniel surveyed this group with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. He could already identify the potential weak links: Marcus's obvious anxiety, Bobby's overconfidence, Amanda's probable underestimation of the physical demands ahead. But he could also see the determination in Rebecca's stance, the quiet competence in David's equipment check, the steady resolve in Jennifer's eyes. This was a good group, he decided. They would push each other and support each other through the challenges ahead. The Bitterroot Range stretched before them, a vast expanse of granite peaks, alpine lakes, and dense forests that had claimed the lives of dozens of hikers, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts over the decades. This particular section of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area was known for its pristine beauty and its substantial grizzly bear population. Daniel had chosen this location deliberately. His advanced survival course was not about comfortable camping, but about learning to function and make critical decisions in environments where mistakes could be fatal. The weather forecast called for clear skies for the first 3 days, with a possible weather system moving in later in the week. Temperatures would range from the mid-40s at night to the mid-70s during the day, at their current elevation of 4,200 feet, though they would be climbing to over 6,000 feet by Wednesday. Daniel had planned their route to take them deep into bear country, past Rattlesnake Creek, over Granite Pass, and down into the Lightning Creek drainage, a 42-mile circuit that would test every skill he intended to teach them. As the group finished organizing their gear, Daniel began his standard opening briefing. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life and death situations, but also the patience of a teacher who understood that most of his students were stepping far outside their comfort zones. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next 5 days, you're going to learn skills that could save your life or the life of someone you care about. We're going to cover wilderness first aid, emergency shelter construction, water procurement and purification, fire starting in adverse conditions, navigation without GPS, signaling for rescue, and emergency food procurement. But more importantly, you're going to learn to think clearly and make good decisions when you're cold, tired, hungry, and scared. He paused, making eye contact with each participant. This is not a camping trip. This is not a guided hike. For the next 5 days, you are going to be genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely challenged, and occasionally genuinely at risk. That's the only way to learn these skills in a meaningful way. Anyone who wants to change their mind can leave now with a full refund and no judgment. No one moved. Daniel nodded approvingly. The Bitterroot Wilderness is home to mountain lions, black bears, and grizzly bears. We are entering their territory, and we will conduct ourselves accordingly. Bear encounters are rare but possible. If we follow proper protocols, storing food correctly, maintaining awareness, staying together, the chances of a dangerous encounter are minimal. But minimal is not zero, and that's something we all need to accept and prepare for. Rebecca raised her hand. What's the protocol if we do encounter a bear? Depends on the species and the situation, Daniel replied. Black bears are generally more timid. Make yourself look large, back away slowly, speak calmly. Don't run unless you're very close to a secure shelter. Grizzlies are more complicated. If it's a defensive encounter, you surprised a mother with cubs, for instance, playing dead might be your best option. If it's a predatory encounter, you fight with everything you have. The problem is telling the difference in the moment. Jason Mitchell pulled out a notebook. How many bear attacks happen in this area each year? Statistically, you're more likely to be struck by lightning, Daniel said, but lightning doesn't stalk you for miles before attacking. Bears are intelligent, adaptable predators. They learn from every human encounter. That's why we take them seriously. He gestured toward the trailhead. Our route takes us through prime grizzly habitat. We'll be camping in areas where bears have been active. We'll be moving through dense vegetation where visibility is limited. These are the conditions that test your skills and your judgment. These are also the conditions where complacency can get you killed. The group began shouldering their packs, each carrying 40 to 50 pounds of gear, including emergency supplies, first aid equipment, shelter materials, and food for 5 days. Daniel had insisted on minimal technological aids, no GPS units, no satellite communicators, no cell phones. Each participant carried a map, compass, and whistle, along with a detailed equipment list that Daniel had refined over years of experience. At 8:47 a.m., they set out on the Bitterroot Trail, a well-maintained path that would take them 6 miles through mixed forest to their first campsite at Meadow Creek. The morning was perfect for hiking, cool enough to prevent overheating but warm enough to be comfortable. The trail initially followed the South Fork of the Bitterroot River, providing easy walking and spectacular scenery. Daniel set a moderate pace, stopping every hour for water breaks and equipment checks. He used these stops to begin instruction, pointing out edible plants, discussing the geology of the region, and beginning to teach the constant environmental awareness that was crucial to wilderness survival. "Notice the claw marks on that tree," he said during their second break, pointing to distinctive gouges in the bark of a large ponderosa pine. Adult grizzly, probably a male based on the height. These marks are how bears communicate, leaving scent from glands in their paws and showing their size to other bears. This mark is relatively fresh, maybe 2 weeks old. Marcus Webb looked nervously at the claw marks, which were over 8 feet high. How big would a bear that made those marks be? Adult male grizzly can weigh anywhere from 400 to 800 pounds, Daniel replied. Average is probably around 600. But weight isn't the issue. It's strength, speed, and intelligence. A grizzly can run 35 miles per hour through forest, where you'd struggle to walk. They can smell you from miles away, and their hearing is extraordinary. As they resumed hiking, Daniel continued his running commentary on their environment. He pointed out game trails, discussed the significance of broken branches and overturned rocks, and began teaching the participants to read the forest like a book. Every disturbed piece of ground told a story. Every unusual configuration of vegetation suggested an animal's passage. The first day's hike was designed to be relatively easy, allowing the group to adjust to their packs, the altitude, and the rhythm of wilderness travel. But Daniel was already observing each participant carefully, noting who was struggling with the weight, who was breathing hard on the modest climbs, who was paying attention to his instruction, and who was simply enduring the experience. By 3:30 p.m., they reached their first campsite in a meadow beside Meadow Creek, surrounded by towering Douglas fir and western larch. The site offered fresh water, level ground for tents, and good visibility in all directions. Daniel had chosen it specifically because it met his criteria for a safe bear camping area, away from obvious bear travel routes, with escape routes available, and with good sight lines. "First rule of bear safety in camp," Daniel announced as the group gathered around him. "Everything that smells like food gets stored in bear canisters or hung at least 12 feet high and 4 feet from any tree trunk. That includes toothpaste, soap, deodorant, and anything else with a scent. Second rule, cooking and eating area is at least 100 yards from where you sleep. Third rule, if a bear comes into camp, do not run toward your tent. Bears associate tents with food because that's where most people store it." The group spent the next 2 hours setting up camp according to Daniel's specifications. Each person had brought a lightweight tent, but Daniel required them to place their shelters in a precise pattern that would allow for mutual support and coordinated response to any emergency. The cooking area was established downwind and downhill from the sleeping area, with all food preparation surfaces thoroughly cleaned after use. As evening approached, Daniel began the first formal instruction session around a carefully contained campfire. The temperature was dropping toward the mid-40s, and several participants were already feeling the chill. Daniel used this as a teaching opportunity, discussing the importance of layered clothing systems and the early recognition of hypothermia symptoms. "Cold kills more people in the wilderness than any predator," he said. "It affects your judgment, your coordination, your ability to make critical decisions. Always stay ahead of the cold, add layers before you need them, eat high-energy foods regularly, stay hydrated. Once you're genuinely cold, you're already in trouble." Rebecca Chen had been taking detailed notes throughout the day. "What about high-altitude effects? We're going to over 6,000 feet later this week." "Good question. Altitude affects everyone differently, but the symptoms are predictable. Headache, nausea, fatigue, difficulty sleeping. The key is recognizing when altitude sickness is becoming serious. Pulmonary edema or cerebral edema can be fatal if not treated immediately, and treatment means descent immediately." As darkness fell over the Bitterroot Mountains, Daniel led the group through night navigation exercises using only starlight and compass bearings. This was one of his favorite parts of the training, watching urban professionals who had never experienced true darkness learn to function without artificial light. Most had never seen the Milky Way with such clarity, and the psychological impact of being small and vulnerable under an infinite sky was part of what Daniel considered essential to genuine wilderness education. At 9:15 p.m., as the temperature dropped to 38 degrees, Daniel gathered the group for final instructions before sleep. "Tonight, someone is always on watch. We'll rotate every 2 hours. The person on watch maintains the fire, listens for unusual sounds, and wakes everyone immediately if there's any sign of large animals in the area. Remember, most predators are active at night, and most dangerous encounters happen when people are sleeping." Jennifer Martinez volunteered for the first watch, from 9:30 to 11:30 p.m. She had been camping many times as a teenager, but never in true wilderness, and never with the knowledge that large predators might be nearby. As the others settled into their tents, she sat by the carefully banked fire, listening to the night sounds of the forest and trying to distinguish between normal nocturnal activity and potential threats. The first night passed without incident, though Jennifer's logs recorded several instances of large animals moving through the forest nearby. Twice she heard the distinctive sound of branches breaking under significant weight, and once she detected what she believed to be the sound of heavy breathing perhaps 50 yards from camp. Each time she followed Daniel's instructions, adding wood to the fire, speaking quietly but clearly to announce human presence, and remaining calm but alert. The sounds moved away without any animals actually approaching the camp. July 7th began at 5:30 a.m. with a temperature of 34 degrees and a light frost on the tents. Daniel roused the group with coffee made over the rekindled fire and a breakfast of oatmeal, supplemented with nuts and dried fruit. As the sun rose over the peaks to the east, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he outlined the day's agenda. Today we climb 8 miles to Lightning Creek Pass, elevation gain of 2,400 feet. This is where we start learning about decision-making under stress. About half of you are going to be seriously challenged by today's hike. That's intentional. I need to see how you function when you're pushed beyond your normal limits. The trail up to Lightning Creek Pass was steep, rocky, and occasionally exposed to significant drop-offs. Daniel had chosen this route specifically because it would separate his students into distinct groups based on their fitness levels and mental toughness. By 11 a.m., the group had already begun to stretch out over nearly a mile of trail, with the strongest hikers setting a pace that the weakest could not match. Marcus Webb was struggling badly, stopping every few hundred yards to catch his breath, and clearly distressed by the physical demands. But when Daniel offered to lighten his pack, Marcus refused, determined to carry his full load regardless of the cost. Rebecca Chen and David Rodriguez were moving well, their medical training having taught them the importance of physical conditioning. Jennifer Martinez was keeping up despite her concern about her fitness level, driven by determination not to be the weak link in the group. Bobby Harrison was hiking strongly, but taking too many risks near the cliff edges, trying to get dramatic photographs despite repeated warnings about the loose rock and exposure. His behavior was concerning Daniel, who recognized the type, someone whose confidence exceeded their judgment, often with dangerous results. The real test came at 12:30 p.m. when the group reached a section of trail that had been damaged by a recent rockslide. The normal path was blocked by a debris field of loose boulders and fallen trees. Daniel had known about this obstacle and planned to use it as a teaching opportunity about route finding and group decision-making under pressure. "This is why we don't depend on trails," he announced as the group gathered at the edge of the slide zone. "Nature doesn't care about your planned route. We have 3 options. Go back and take a different trail, adding 6 miles in a day to our schedule. Try to cross the slide, which is dangerous but doable, or find an alternative route around it, which means bushwhacking through unknown terrain." He let the group debate for 20 minutes, observing how they processed information, dealt with stress, and reached consensus. Rebecca and David favored the careful crossing, using rope systems and proper safety techniques. Marcus wanted to go back, clearly intimidated by the technical challenge. Bobby was ready to charge across without adequate safety measures, while Amanda questioned whether they should continue at all. Eventually, they decided to cross using techniques Daniel taught them on the spot, setting up belay systems, testing each foot placement, moving one person at a time while others maintained safety lines. The crossing took 2 hours and tested everyone's nerve, but it also built group cohesion and confidence. By 3 p.m., when they reached the other side, the participants were beginning to function as a team rather than a collection of individuals. The campsite at Lightning Creek Pass was spectacular but challenging. Above tree line at 6,100 feet, exposed to weather and requiring careful site selection to avoid wind and potential lightning strikes. Daniel used the site selection process as another teaching opportunity, explaining how topography, vegetation, and weather patterns had to be considered when choosing where to spend the night in the mountains. As they set up camp, Daniel noticed several concerning signs. Fresh bear scat near the creek, perhaps 2 days old based on its condition. Claw marks on several trees, including some that appeared very recent. Most troubling, a game trail that showed heavy use by large animals, passing within 50 yards of their campsite. "We're definitely in active bear habitat," he announced to the group as they gathered for dinner preparation. "Everyone needs to be extra careful about food storage and camp hygiene tonight. We're going to double our watch schedule, one person awake at all times, rotating every hour and a half." The evening passed with increasing tension as night sounds seemed more prominent and threatening at the higher elevation. The wind through the sparse vegetation created unusual noises that could easily be mistaken for large animals moving nearby. Several times during the night, watchkeepers reported hearing what sounded like heavy footsteps or breathing near the perimeter of camp, but flashlight searches revealed nothing. Michelle Torres, during her 2 to 3:30 a.m. watch, made an entry in the group log that would later be considered significant. "Large animal, definitely moving through area. Multiple sounds of branches breaking, heavy footsteps on rocks near creek. Animal appears to be circling camp at distance of maybe 100 yards. Sounds too large for deer or elk, maintaining fire and remaining alert." July 8th dawned clear and cold, with temperatures in the upper 20s and ice on the water containers. Daniel had planned this day as the culmination of their wilderness experience, a 12-mile traverse across challenging terrain to a remote campsite in the Lightning Creek drainage, followed by night navigation exercises and solo survival challenges. The group was noticeably more cohesive and confident as they broke camp and began the day's hike. The previous day's challenges had eliminated the artificial social barriers that had existed initially, and they were beginning to function as a genuine team. Marcus had found his pace and was no longer struggling with the physical demands. Bobby had become more cautious after a near miss on the rock slide. Everyone was paying attention to Daniel's ongoing instruction about reading the environment and recognizing potential hazards. The trail down from Lightning Creek Pass was steep and technical, requiring careful foot placement and constant attention to balance. Daniel used the descent to teach techniques for safe movement on loose rock and steep terrain, but he was also becoming increasingly concerned about signs of bear activity. They encountered fresh scat twice during the morning, and the claw marks on trees were becoming more frequent and more recent. At 11:45 a.m., they reached the bottom of the descent and entered the Lightning Creek drainage proper. A narrow valley with dense vegetation, limited visibility, and what Daniel recognized as perfect bear habitat. The creek provided fresh water and supported lush plant growth that attracted elk and deer, which in turn attracted predators. The thick stands of huckleberry bushes were a favorite food source for bears, and the numerous deadfalls and rocky outcroppings provided ideal bedding sites. "From here to tonight's campsite, we stay together," Daniel announced. "No one gets more than 20 yards from the group. We make noise constantly, talk, sing, whatever it takes to avoid surprising anything. Bears don't like surprises any more than we do." The afternoon hike through the Lightning Creek drainage was among the most beautiful and challenging terrain Daniel had ever guided a group through. Ancient cedars towered over 200 feet above them, their massive trunks scarred by centuries of forest fires. The understory was thick with ferns, devil's club, and huckleberry bushes. Small waterfalls cascaded down granite cliffs, creating a constant background of rushing water that masked other sounds. But Daniel was increasingly uneasy. The signs of bear activity were everywhere: fresh diggings where bears had been foraging for roots, trees with bark stripped away to access the cambium layer underneath, and most concerning, what appeared to be a recent daybed in a thicket of brush just 20 yards from the trail. The depression in the vegetation was large enough to have been made by an adult grizzly, and the surrounding area showed signs of heavy use. At 2:30 p.m., they stopped for a rest break beside a series of beaver ponds. The area was beautiful, but also showed extensive bear activity: tracks in the mud, fish bones scattered along the shore, and more claw marks on trees. Daniel was beginning to consider altering their route when Rebecca Chen approached him with a concern. "Daniel, I've been watching our surroundings, and I think we might be being followed," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm the others. "I've noticed the same broken branch configuration behind us several times in the last hour, and I could swear I've heard large animal sounds keeping pace with us." Daniel had been having the same concern but hadn't wanted to alarm the group unnecessarily. "What specifically have you noticed?" "Sounds of movement in the brush parallel to our route. Occasional glimpses of something large moving through the trees. And twice I've seen what looked like a large, dark shape maybe 100 yards behind us, just at the edge of visibility." This was exactly what Daniel had been trained to watch for. The stalking behavior of a large predator that had become interested in the group. Bears didn't usually stalk humans unless they were either extremely hungry or had learned to associate people with food. Either possibility was dangerous. "We're going to alter our route," Daniel decided. "Instead of continuing down the drainage, we're going to climb out of here and camp tonight in more open terrain where we have better visibility and escape routes." But as he gathered the group to explain the change in plans, Kevin Murphy, the park ranger, approached with troubling news. "Daniel, I found something you need to see," he said, gesturing toward a deadfall about 30 yards from where they had been resting. Hidden behind the fallen tree was evidence of a bear cache, the partially buried remains of an elk calf, covered with dirt, rocks, and vegetation in the characteristic manner of a grizzly bear preserving food for later consumption. The cache was fresh, probably no more than 24 hours old, and the surrounding area showed extensive bear activity. "This changes everything," Daniel said grimly. "We've stumbled into an active feeding area. The bear that made this cache is going to be nearby, and it's going to be aggressive about defending its food source." As if summoned by his words, a low growling sound emerged from the dense vegetation uphill from their location. It was a sound that bypassed rational thought and triggered the most primitive fear responses in the human brain. The warning vocalization of a large, dangerous predator that was not afraid of human presence. "Everyone move slowly toward the creek," Daniel commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death situations. "Stay together. Don't run. Don't make eye contact with whatever is up there. We're going to back away from this area carefully and deliberately." But as the group began to move, the growling intensified and was joined by the sound of heavy footsteps and breaking branches. Through the gaps in the vegetation, they caught their first glimpse of the animal that had been stalking them. A massive grizzly bear, easily 600 pounds, with the distinctive shoulder hump and dished face that marked it as an adult male. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, and it moved with the fluid power of an apex predator in its prime. The bear appeared at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 40 yards away, and stopped to assess the situation. For a moment, neither humans nor bear moved, as if both sides were calculating their options. Daniel had his hand on the bear spray attached to his belt, but he knew that at this distance in the wind it would be of limited effectiveness. "Back toward the creek, slowly," Daniel repeated, never taking his eyes off the bear. "No sudden movements, no loud sounds. We're going to give him space to access his cache." For several heartbeats, it seemed like the strategy might work. The bear appeared to be considering whether the humans represented a threat to its food source, and Daniel hoped it would conclude that they were leaving the area voluntarily. But as the group continued their slow retreat, Jason Mitchell made a critical error in judgment. Despite explicit instructions about not photographing wildlife, he pulled out his camera and attempted to capture an image of the grizzly. The camera's autofocus mechanism made a distinctive beeping sound as it locked onto the bear, and the sound triggered an immediate change in the animal's behavior. The bear's ears flattened against its head, its lips curled back to reveal massive canine teeth, and it began making a huffing sound that Daniel recognized as the prelude to a charge. The animal dropped to all fours and began what experts call a stress test, a series of short, aggressive movements designed to gauge the response of potential threats. "Run!" Daniel commanded, abandoning all pretense of calm. "Everyone run for the creek now. Stay together, but move fast." The next 30 seconds unfolded with the surreal clarity that often accompanies life-threatening situations. The group scrambled toward the creek, abandoning their carefully maintained formation as survival instincts overrode training. Behind them, the grizzly made its decision and launched into a full charge, covering ground with terrifying speed through vegetation that would have been nearly impassable for humans. Daniel, trained by years of military experience to protect those under his command, turned to face the charging bear with his bear spray ready. At 15 yards, he triggered the spray, sending a cloud of capsicum-based deterrent toward the animal. The bear ran directly through the spray without slowing, its momentum carrying it forward despite the chemical irritant. The impact when the grizzly reached Daniel was devastating and final. The animal's first swipe, delivered with claws that extended 4 inches beyond its massive paw, caught Daniel across the torso with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him flying backward into a large boulder. The sound of the impact, a wet, crushing noise, that combined breaking bones with tearing flesh, would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Daniel's body struck the boulder with his spine, taking the full force of the collision. The combination of the bear's claws and the rock impact caused massive internal injuries that would have been fatal even with immediate medical intervention. He was unconscious before his body hit the ground, and he never regained consciousness. But the bear's aggression was not satisfied by eliminating the immediate threat. Grizzlies, unlike black bears, sometimes continue attacking even after the threat has been neutralized, particularly when they are defending a food source. The animal turned its attention to the fleeing humans, selecting targets with the calculated intelligence that makes grizzlies among the most dangerous predators in North America. Marcus Webb, struggling with the uneven terrain and handicapped by his limited physical conditioning, was the first to be overtaken. The bear caught him just as he reached the creek bank, its jaws closing on his left shoulder and upper arm with a crushing force that shattered bones and severed muscles. Marcus's scream, a sound of pure terror and agony, carried across the wilderness and would later be used by search and rescue teams to locate the attack site. The bear shook Marcus like a dog shaking a toy, its powerful neck muscles lifting his 180-pound body off the ground and slamming him back down onto the rocky creek bed. The attack lasted perhaps 15 seconds, but in that time, Marcus sustained injuries that would require years of reconstruction surgery and would leave him permanently disabled. His left arm was nearly severed, held to his body primarily by skin and a few intact tendons. His shoulder blade was fractured in multiple places and his collarbone was completely shattered. As Marcus lay motionless and presumably dead, the bear turned its attention to the rest of the group, who had scattered in different directions despite Daniel's instructions to stay together. The animal's hunting instincts, once triggered, drove it to pursue multiple targets with relentless efficiency. Bobby Harrison, the construction foreman whose overconfidence had been a concern throughout the trip, had climbed onto a deadfall log, apparently believing that elevation would provide safety. This decision proved nearly fatal. Bears are exceptional climbers, and the grizzly reached Bobby's position within seconds. The initial attack knocked him from the log onto the rocky ground below, where the bear's weight, over 600 pounds, pinned him helplessly. The animal's jaws closed on Bobby's right thigh, its canine teeth penetrating completely through the muscle and striking bone. The pressure was sufficient to fracture Bobby's femur, the strongest bone in the human body. But more significantly, the bear's teeth severed the femoral artery, causing massive blood loss that began immediately pumping Bobby's life onto the forest floor. Bobby remained conscious throughout the attack, screaming for help and trying desperately to fight off an animal that outweighed him by 400 pounds and possessed strength that dwarfed human capabilities. His attempts to punch and kick the bear were less effective than a child's tantrum against an adult. The grizzly maintained its grip on his thigh for nearly 30 seconds before releasing him and moving on to other targets. Rebecca Chen, despite her medical training and normally analytical approach to crisis situations, found herself operating on pure instinct. She had managed to reach a steep embankment beside the creek and was attempting to climb to higher ground when the bear spotted her. The animal's approach was deliberate and calculated, suggesting that it was not acting from blind rage, but was making strategic decisions about which threats to eliminate first. The bear caught Rebecca as she reached a narrow ledge about 8 feet above the creek. Its initial swipe caught her across the back and shoulders, the claws raking through her backpack and into the flesh beneath. The force of the blow sent her tumbling back down the embankment, where she landed hard on her left side. She felt ribs crack from the impact and tasted blood in her mouth, but adrenaline kept her moving. The bear followed her down the embankment, its massive bulk moving with surprising agility on the steep terrain. Rebecca rolled toward the creek, hoping the water might provide some protection, but the animal was on her before she could reach safety. This time, its jaws closed on her left leg just below the knee, and she felt bones snap under the pressure. The attack on Rebecca lasted longer than the others because she remained conscious and mobile, continuing to fight and attempt escape. The bear maintained its grip on her leg while using its free paw to strike at her torso and head. She sustained a concussion from a blow to her left temple, several more broken ribs, and deep lacerations across her arms and shoulders where she tried to protect her vital organs. The sounds of the attack, the bears growling and huffing, the screams of the victims, the wet sounds of claws and teeth striking flesh, created a cacophony of horror that paralyzed some of the other group members while galvanizing others into action. Several participants, including Jennifer Martinez and David Rodriguez, overcame their terror sufficiently to begin coordinating a response. David, whose paramedic training had prepared him for traumatic situations, began shouting instructions to the scattered group members. "Everyone who's not injured, get to high ground and stay together. Make noise. Throw rocks. Don't let it focus on one person." His training told him that their only chance of survival lay in convincing the bear that the cost of continuing its attack outweighed the benefits of defending its food cache. Bears, despite their reputation for mindless aggression, are actually quite capable of cost-benefit analysis and will often break off an attack if the resistance becomes too costly. Jennifer Martinez, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed, began throwing rocks at the bear while screaming at the top of her lungs. Her projectiles were too small to cause injury to the massive animal, but they served to distract it and divide its attention among multiple targets. Kevin Murphy, the park ranger, had managed to reach a position where he could see the entire attack scene. His training had included protocols for dealing with aggressive wildlife, and he knew that their situation was desperate. He began coordinating the group's response, shouting instructions to maintain noise and aggression while looking for opportunities to help the wounded. The bear, now covered in blood from its 3 victims, appeared to be considering its next move. It had successfully defended its food cache and eliminated the most immediate threats, but the continued noise and aggression from the remaining humans seemed to be causing it to recalculate the situation. Bears generally prefer to avoid prolonged confrontations, especially when they have already achieved their primary objective. After what seemed like hours, but was actually less than 4 minutes from the initial charge, The grizzly began to withdraw toward its food cache. It moved slowly, frequently looking back at the humans and huffing warnings, but it did not press its attack against the survivors who remained at a distance. As soon as the bear disappeared into the thick vegetation surrounding its cache, David Rodriguez began triaging the wounded. His paramedic training took over, suppressing his emotional response to the carnage and focusing on the medical priorities. He quickly identified Daniel as beyond help. The combination of massive trauma from the bear's claws and the impact with the boulder had caused injuries that would have been fatal even in a hospital setting. Marcus Webb was unconscious and had lost massive amounts of blood, but he was still breathing. His left arm was hanging by threads of skin and tendon, and his pulse was weak and rapid, classic signs of shock from blood loss. David immediately began pressure point compression to slow the bleeding while shouting for others to bring first aid supplies. Bobby Harrison was conscious but going into shock from blood loss. The femoral artery damage was continuing to pump blood onto the ground, and David estimated that he might have only minutes before blood loss became fatal. Using techniques from his emergency medical training, David applied direct pressure to the wound while attempting to locate and compress the artery itself. Rebecca Chen, despite her own injuries, was attempting to remain conscious and provide medical guidance from her position beside the creek. Her medical knowledge was more extensive than David's, and she was calling out instructions for treating traumatic injuries even as she struggled with her own pain and blood loss. The next hour was a desperate struggle to keep the three most seriously injured victims alive while simultaneously watching for the bear's return and attempting to coordinate a rescue operation. The group's isolation. They were 15 miles from the nearest road and in an area with no cell phone coverage meant that help could not be summoned immediately. Kevin Murphy, as the park ranger with the most relevant emergency training, took charge of the overall situation. His first priority was establishing a secure perimeter and ensuring that the bear would not return to continue its attack. He posted lookouts with instructions to maintain constant watch on the area around the food cache, and he began planning evacuation routes in case the bear returned. Meanwhile, David Rodriguez and Jennifer Martinez worked frantically to stabilize the wounded. Using supplies from the group's first aid kits and improvising with clothing and equipment, they managed to slow the bleeding from Marcus's arm and Bobby's leg. Rebecca's injuries, while serious, were less immediately life-threatening, though her broken leg would require surgical repair and her concussion needed monitoring for signs of brain swelling. The emotional trauma to the survivors was almost as devastating as the physical injuries to the victims. Several group members were experiencing what psychologists would later identify as acute stress reactions, symptoms including dissociation, uncontrollable shaking, nausea, and temporary paralysis. Amanda Foster was found sitting motionless beside a tree, staring at the blood-soaked ground, and apparently unable to process what had happened. Jason Mitchell, whose camera use had inadvertently triggered the attack, was experiencing what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown. He alternated between hysteria and catatonic stillness, repeatedly attempting to blame himself for the disaster while also denying that it had actually happened. As the immediate medical crisis stabilized somewhat, Kevin Murphy began organizing the evacuation operation. The group had two basic options: attempt to carry the wounded back to the trailhead, a distance of nearly 20 miles through difficult terrain, or send the strongest hikers ahead to summon professional rescue teams while maintaining a defensive position around the wounded. The decision was complicated by several factors. Moving the seriously injured victims risked causing additional damage, particularly to Marcus's nearly severed arm and Bobby's fractured femur. But remaining in place meant staying in active bear habitat with limited supplies and no way to contact the outside world. Additionally, weather reports had called for possible storms later in the week, and exposure to severe weather could be fatal for victims already weakened by trauma and blood loss. Kevin made the decision to split the group. He would lead the 4 strongest and most experienced hikers, Jennifer Martinez, Lisa Wang, Gregory Palmer, and Michelle Torres, in a forced march back to the trailhead to summon help. The remaining survivors would maintain a defensive position around the wounded, with David Rodriguez providing ongoing medical care and the others maintaining security against the bear's possible return. The evacuation team departed at 6:30 p.m., carrying minimal gear and planning to hike through the night to reach the trailhead by dawn. They carried detailed information about the attack location, the nature of the injuries, and the resources that would be needed for a rescue operation. Their route would take them back over Lightning Creek Pass and down the steep trail they had ascended 2 days earlier, a journey that would test their physical and emotional limits. Those remaining at the attack site, David Rodriguez, Sarah Kim, Janet Stevens, Robert Harrison, Bobby's brother, who had insisted on staying despite his own emotional distress, and Amanda Foster, began preparing for what they knew would be a long night. They moved the wounded to a more defensible position away from the bear's food cache, established a watch rotation, and began the psychological challenge of maintaining morale and hope while surrounded by evidence of the attack. The bear remained in the area throughout the night, occasionally visible at the edges of their vision and audible as it moved through the forest nearby. Its presence was a constant reminder that their situation remained desperate and that any mistake could trigger another attack. The survivors took turns maintaining a fire and watching the perimeter, while David continued monitoring the vital signs of the 3 injured victims. Marcus Webb regained consciousness several times during the night, but his condition remained critical. The blood loss had weakened him severely, and David was concerned about infection from the massive wound to his arm. Using antibiotics from the group's medical kit, David began preventive treatment, but he knew that Marcus needed surgical intervention within hours to have any chance of saving his arm. Bobby Harrison drifted in and out of consciousness, his condition stabilized by David's successful compression of the femoral artery, but still critical due to blood loss and the psychological trauma of the attack. His fractured femur would require surgical repair, and David was concerned about fat embolism, a potentially fatal complication of major bone fractures. Rebecca Chen remained conscious and alert despite her injuries, providing medical guidance and helping to maintain group morale. Her broken leg had been immobilized using improvised splints, and her concussion seemed to be stable, though David continued monitoring her neurological signs for any indication of brain swelling. The evacuation team, meanwhile, was pushing through the darkness with desperate urgency. Jennifer Martinez had emerged as the group's leader, setting a pace that kept them moving steadily toward help while ensuring that no one became separated or lost. Her biology teaching background had given her more outdoor experience than the others, and her maternal instincts were driving her to succeed in bringing help to the wounded. The night hike back to Lightning Creek Pass was a nightmare of loose rock, steep terrain, and psychological pressure. Each member of the evacuation team was dealing with their own trauma from witnessing the attack, while simultaneously pushing their bodies beyond normal limits. Michelle Torres, despite her police training, found herself struggling with flashbacks to the attack every time they encountered shadows or unusual sounds. Gregory Palmer, the retired military officer, provided crucial leadership and navigation skills, but he was also battling his own demons. His military experience had exposed him to combat casualties, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a massive predator systematically attacking people under his protection. He found himself questioning every decision he had made during the crisis and struggling with survivor's guilt. By 3 a.m., the evacuation team had reached Lightning Creek Pass, but they were physically and emotionally exhausted. Lisa Wang, the nurse practitioner, was beginning to show signs of altitude sickness, and Jennifer Martinez was dealing with severe dehydration. They rested for 30 minutes, sharing their remaining water and energy food, before beginning the descent toward the trailhead. The descent in darkness was treacherous, with loose rock and steep drop-offs creating constant danger of serious injury. But the team pressed on, driven by the knowledge that every minute of delay might mean the difference between life and death for their injured companions. They reached the trailhead parking area at 5:45 a.m., nearly 12 hours after the attack, and immediately began attempts to contact emergency services. The initial emergency response was complicated by the remote location and the lack of cell phone coverage at the trailhead. Jennifer Martinez had to drive nearly 20 miles back toward civilization before she could establish contact with 911 dispatchers. Her first call, logged at 6:23 a.m. on July 9th, triggered one of the largest wilderness rescue operations in Montana history. The Ravalli County Sheriff's Department, contacted by 911 dispatchers, immediately began coordinating a multi-agency response. The initial response included the Ravalli County Search and Rescue Team, personnel from the Bitterroot National Forest, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officers, and medical personnel from Marcus Daly Memorial Hospital in Hamilton. Additional resources were requested from neighboring counties and from specialized wilderness rescue teams. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the Emergency Department Director at Marcus Daly Memorial Hospital, was contacted at home and immediately began preparing for multiple trauma patients with severe injuries. Based on the initial reports from the evacuation team, she anticipated the need for emergency surgery, blood transfusions, and possible medical evacuation to larger trauma centers in Missoula or Billings. The first rescue helicopter, a Bell 206 operated by the Montana Department of Justice, was airborne by 7:15 a.m., with a crew consisting of pilot Tom Bradley, flight medic Janet Chen, and search and rescue coordinator Captain Mike Sullivan. Their initial mission was to locate the attack site and assess the condition of the victims and remaining survivors. Ground teams began assembling at the trailhead by 8 a.m. The initial ground response included 12 members of the Ravalli County Search and Rescue Team, 4 Forest Service personnel, 2 Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officers, and 3 paramedics from the Hamilton Fire Department. They carried advanced medical equipment, communications gear, and specialized litters designed for evacuating patients through difficult terrain. The helicopter crew spotted the attack site at 8:32 a.m., identifying it by the smoke from the survivors' signal fire and the reflective emergency blankets they had spread to attract attention. Captain Sullivan's initial report indicated 3 seriously injured victims, 6 survivors in apparently stable condition, and obvious signs of a large predator attack. The helicopter's first priority was inserting flight medic Janet Chen at the scene to assess and stabilize the victims for evacuation. The landing zone, hastily cleared by the survivors, was marginal for helicopter operations, small, surrounded by tall trees, and at an elevation that reduced the aircraft's lifting capacity. Pilot Tom Bradley later described it as one of the most challenging landings of his career. Janet Chen's initial assessment confirmed the severity of the situation. Marcus Webb was in critical condition from blood loss and was showing signs of infection in his mangled arm. Bobby Harrison was stable but would require immediate surgical intervention for his leg injuries. Rebecca Chen was in the best condition of the 3 but still needed evacuation for proper treatment of her fractured leg and concussion. The helicopter evacuation was complicated by weight restrictions and the marginal landing zone. Only 1 patient could be evacuated per flight, meaning multiple trips would be required. the decision was made to evacuate Marcus first due to the severity of his condition, followed by Bobby and then Rebecca. Marcus Webb was airborne at 9:15 a.m. for the 40-minute flight to Marcus Daly Memorial Hospital. During the flight, he suffered cardiac arrest, probably from a combination of blood loss, shock, and fat embolism from his fractured bones. Flight medic Janet Chen managed to re-establish a heartbeat using CPR and advanced cardiac life support protocols, but Marcus arrived at the hospital in extremely critical condition. Dr. Sarah Mitchell and her trauma team were waiting when the helicopter landed at the hospital at 9:55 a.m. Marcus was immediately taken to the operating room, where orthopedic surgeon Dr. James Rodriguez and vascular surgeon Dr. Patricia Williams began the complex process of attempting to save his arm and his life. The surgery would last 7 hours and require massive blood transfusions, but it ultimately succeeded in reattaching his arm, though with permanent loss of function. Meanwhile, the second helicopter evacuation of Bobby Harrison encountered complications when the aircraft developed mechanical problems during startup. A backup helicopter was summoned from Missoula, but the delay meant that Bobby remained at the attack site for an additional 3 hours. During this time, his condition deteriorated, and he began showing signs of shock and possible internal bleeding. The backup helicopter, operated by Life Flight from St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, arrived at the scene at 1:45 p.m. Bobby was evacuated without further complications and arrived at the hospital at 2:30 p.m., where he was met by trauma surgeon Dr. Michael Kim and orthopedic specialist Dr. Lisa Park. His surgery focused on repairing the femoral artery damage and stabilizing his fractured femur. The operation was successful, though Bobby would require months of rehabilitation and would walk with a permanent limp. Rebecca Chen was evacuated on the third helicopter flight, arriving at Marcus Daly Memorial Hospital at 4:20 p.m. Her injuries, while serious, were less immediately life-threatening, and she was able to provide detailed medical information about her condition to the treating physicians. Her surgery to repair her fractured leg was routine, though she would require additional procedures to address nerve damage from the bear's bite. The evacuation of Daniel Price's body was delayed until the following day due to the complexity of the recovery operation and the need to ensure the bear was no longer in the immediate area. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks officers conducted an aerial survey of the attack site and determined that the grizzly had abandoned its food cache and moved deeper into the wilderness. A ground team recovered Daniel's body on July 10th, confirming that he had died almost instantly from massive trauma. The investigation into the attack began immediately, led by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks bear specialist Dr. Frank Wilson. His preliminary examination of the attack site revealed several critical factors that had contributed to the disaster. The group had unknowingly camped near an active bear feeding area, and their presence had been detected by the animal, which had begun stalking them during their final day of hiking. The triggering incident, Jason Mitchell's camera use, had transformed what might have been a defensive encounter into an aggressive predatory attack. The camera's autofocus sound had been interpreted by the bear as a threat signal, causing it to escalate from warning behavior to full attack mode. Dr. Wilson noted that this type of trigger was increasingly common as more people brought electronic devices into bear habitat. The bear itself was identified through DNA analysis of saliva samples taken from the victim's clothing and equipment. The animal was a 15-year-old male grizzly with a history of human encounters, including 2 previous incidents where it had approached campsites and been driven away by bear spray. Wildlife officials classified it as a habituated bear that had lost its natural fear of humans and learned to associate people with food sources. The decision about the bear's fate was controversial and difficult. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks policy required the destruction of any bear that had killed or seriously injured humans, but some wildlife advocates argued that the bear had been defending its natural territory and food source. Ultimately, the decision was made to hunt and destroy the animal, both to prevent future attacks and to recover additional DNA evidence for the investigation. The hunt for the bear was conducted by a specialized team from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, using tracking dogs and helicopter support. The animal was located 3 days after the attack, approximately 8 miles from the original site. It was destroyed by a single rifle shot, and necropsy revealed that it was in excellent health and weighed 647 pounds, confirming witness estimates of its massive size. The media coverage of the attack was immediate and intense. News of a fatal bear attack on a wilderness survival training group made national headlines, with coverage by CNN, Fox News, NBC, and major newspapers across the country. The story had all the elements that modern media craved: outdoor adventure gone wrong, a charismatic instructor killed in the line of duty, and dramatic rescue operations in pristine wilderness. Initial reporting focused on the heroism of Daniel Price, who had died defending his students, and the courage of the evacuation team who had hiked through the night to summon help. But as more details emerged, the coverage became more complex and sometimes controversial. Questions were raised about the wisdom of taking inexperienced people into dangerous bear habitat, about the adequacy of safety protocols, and about whether the attack could have been prevented. Jason Mitchell, whose camera use had triggered the attack, became the focus of particularly intense scrutiny. Wildlife experts and survival instructors criticized his decision to photograph the bear despite explicit warnings, while others argued that his actions, while unwise, did not justify the bear's level of aggression. Mitchell himself refused all interview requests and was reported to be receiving psychological counseling for severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The legal implications of the attack began emerging within weeks of the incident. Families of the victims filed wrongful death and personal injury lawsuits against Mountain Forge Survival Training, alleging inadequate safety protocols and negligent exposure to known dangers. The litigation would continue for years, with settlements eventually reached in most cases, though the amounts were never disclosed. The psychological aftermath of the attack proved to be as challenging as the physical injuries for many of the survivors. Post-traumatic stress disorder was diagnosed in 8 of the 9 survivors, with symptoms ranging from nightmares and flashbacks to complete avoidance of outdoor activities. Several survivors required years of therapy to process their experiences and return to normal functioning. Jennifer Martinez, who had emerged as a leader during the crisis, struggled with survivors' guilt and repeatedly questioned whether she could have done more to prevent the attack or help the victims. Her experience during the night evacuation had given her confidence in her outdoor abilities, but it had also exposed her to trauma that would affect her for years. She eventually became involved in wilderness safety education, using her experience to help others avoid similar tragedies. David Rodriguez, whose medical training had been crucial in keeping the victims alive, found himself unable to return to work as a paramedic for over a year. The attack had shown him the limitations of his training when faced with massive trauma in a wilderness setting, and he struggled with feelings of inadequacy despite the recognition that his actions had saved lives. He eventually transitioned to emergency department nursing, finding that the controlled hospital environment was more manageable than field emergency medicine. Marcus Webb's recovery was long and difficult, requiring multiple surgeries to restore partial function to his injured arm. He never regained full use of the limb and was forced to modify his career and lifestyle to accommodate his disability. But he also became an advocate for bear safety education and worked with wildlife officials to develop better protocols for outdoor recreation in bear habitat. Bobby Harrison's physical recovery was more successful, though he walked with a permanent limp and experienced chronic pain from his leg injuries. His emotional recovery was more challenging, as he struggled with guilt over his risky behavior during the hike and his perceived failure to help other victims during the attack. He eventually found healing through involvement in search and rescue work, using his experience to help others in wilderness emergencies. Rebecca Chen returned to her work as a surgeon, but found that her perspective on risk and safety had been fundamentally altered by the attack. She became involved in wilderness medicine training and worked to improve emergency protocols for outdoor recreation groups. Her medical knowledge of her own injuries and the treatment process helped her cope with the trauma more effectively than some other survivors. The impact on the families of the survivors was profound and often overlooked in media coverage of the attack. Spouses, children, and parents struggled with their own trauma as they watched their loved ones deal with physical injuries and psychological wounds. Support groups were established to help family members understand and cope with the long-term effects of the attack. The outdoor recreation industry was also affected by the attack, as it highlighted the inherent risks in wilderness activities and raised questions about liability and safety protocols. Many guide services and training programs revised their safety procedures, implemented more stringent screening of participants, and increased their insurance coverage. Some companies stopped operating in areas with significant bear populations, while others invested in better safety equipment and training. The attack led to significant changes in bear management policies in the region. The Forest Service implemented new regulations requiring bear-proof food storage containers in certain areas, increased ranger patrols during peak season, and expanded educational programs about bear safety. Trail closures became more common when bear activity was detected, and warning systems were improved to provide better information to wilderness users. Research into bear behavior and human-bear interactions was expanded following the attack, with scientists studying the factors that had contributed to the incident. The role of electronic devices in triggering bear attacks became a particular focus, leading to recommendations about the use of cameras and other equipment in bear habitat. Studies of bear stalking behavior also increased as researchers worked to understand how to recognize and respond to this particularly dangerous situation. The economic impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate costs of rescue operations and medical treatment. Tourism in the Bitterroot Range declined significantly in the months following the attack, as potential visitors were deterred by fears of bear encounters. Local businesses that depended on outdoor recreation saw substantial losses, and some never fully recovered. Insurance implications were also significant, as the attack led to increased premiums for outdoor recreation businesses and more restrictive coverage policies. Some insurance companies stopped covering activities in high-risk bear habitat altogether, forcing some guide services to relocate or cease operations. The attack became a case study in wilderness safety education programs across the country. Daniel Price's decision to take inexperienced people into dangerous habitat was analyzed and debated by outdoor professionals, leading to the development of more rigorous standards for guide qualifications and participant screening. The incident was used to illustrate the importance of proper planning, risk assessment, and emergency preparedness in wilderness activities. Medical professionals also studied the attack for lessons about wilderness trauma care and evacuation procedures. The challenges faced by David Rodriguez in treating severe injuries with limited resources became teaching examples in wilderness medicine courses. The helicopter evacuation operations were analyzed to improve protocols for rescuing patients from remote locations with marginal landing zones. 5 years after the attack, the survivors gathered for a memorial service honoring Daniel Price and recognizing the courage of those who had responded to the crisis. The service, held at the trailhead where their journey had begun, was attended by family members, rescue personnel, and wildlife officials who had been involved in the incident and its aftermath. The memorial included the dedication of a wilderness safety education display that used the attack as a teaching tool for future outdoor enthusiasts. The display emphasized the importance of proper preparation, awareness of wildlife hazards, and appropriate response to emergency situations. It also honored Daniel Price's commitment to outdoor education while acknowledging the tragic outcome of his final expedition. The long-term psychological impact of the attack continued to affect survivors and their families years later. Some found healing through outdoor activities, gradually rebuilding their confidence in wilderness settings. Others never returned to hiking or camping, their relationship with nature permanently altered by the trauma. Professional counseling and support groups remained important resources for many survivors as they continued working through the emotional aftermath of their experience. The bear attack in the Lightning Creek drainage became one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed wildlife attacks in Montana history. The combination of detailed survivor accounts, extensive physical evidence, and comprehensive investigation provided unprecedented insights into the factors that can lead to dangerous human-bear encounters. The lessons learned from this tragic incident continue to inform wilderness safety practices and bear management policies throughout North America. The story of the Mountain Forge Survival Training Group's encounter with a grizzly bear serves as a sobering reminder of the inherent risks in wilderness recreation and the importance of respecting the power and unpredictability of wild animals. While such attacks remain statistically rare, the devastating impact on those involved demonstrates the need for constant vigilance, proper preparation, and humility when entering the domain of large predators. The attack also illustrated the courage and resilience of ordinary people when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The actions of the evacuation team, the medical care provided by untrained individuals, and the coordination of rescue operations showed human beings at their best during a time of crisis. These positive aspects of the story, while overshadowed by the tragedy, provided important lessons about leadership, teamwork, and the capacity for heroism that exists within seemingly ordinary individuals. The Bitterroot Mountains continue to attract outdoor enthusiasts seeking the challenge and beauty of genuine wilderness. The attack site itself has returned to its natural state, with no permanent markers of the tragedy that occurred there. Wildlife, including bears, continues to thrive in the area, following the ancient patterns of survival that have existed for millennia. The wilderness remains unchanged, indifferent to human tragedy, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. For those who survived the attack and those who lost loved ones, the mountains will always hold different meanings. Some see them as places of terror to be avoided, while others view them as sacred ground where courage was tested and found sufficient. The wilderness that gave Daniel Price purpose in life also claimed his life, creating a complex legacy that defies simple interpretation. The story continues to evolve as survivors age, heal, and find new ways to make meaning from their experience. Children and grandchildren of survivors grow up hearing about the attack, carrying forward lessons about nature, survival, and human resilience. The incident becomes part of family history, community memory, and regional folklore, ensuring that its lessons will endure long after those who lived through it are gone. In the end, the grisly attack of July 8, 2024 stands as a testament to the enduring power of wilderness to test human beings at the deepest levels. It reminds us that despite our technological advances and urban lifestyles, we remain vulnerable to forces beyond our control when we venture into the domain of wild animals. It also demonstrates that in our darkest moments, when faced with primal terror and mortal danger, human beings are capable of extraordinary courage, selflessness, and determination to survive and protect others. The next story is Bear Kills 3 Hikers on Appalachian Trail, September 6, 2025. The morning mist clung to the ancient ridgelines of Shenandoah National Park like a shroud, masking the dense hardwood forests in an ethereal silence that should have been peaceful. Instead, it would become the backdrop for one of the most brutal wildlife attacks in Virginia's recorded history. At exactly 6:47 a.m. on September 6, 2025, Dr. Abigail Ross adjusted her lightweight hiking pack one final time in the Skyland Resort parking lot, her breath visible in the crisp 42-degree air as she checked her GPS coordinates against the detailed topographical map spread across the hood of her silver Honda CR-V. Abigail, a 34-year-old emergency room physician from Richmond, had been planning this 3-day backpacking expedition for months. Standing 5'6" with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she wore the confident expression of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. Her medical training had taught her to prepare for every contingency, which was why her pack contained not just the standard wilderness first aid kit, but also prescription antibiotics, emergency sutures, and a satellite communicator that could reach emergency services even in the deepest hollows of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She had no way of knowing that in less than 9 hours, her medical expertise would prove utterly inadequate against the primal fury of a 600-pound black bear protecting territory she couldn't see, smell, or comprehend. Thomas Nguyen pulled his red Subaru Outback into the space beside Abigail's vehicle at precisely 6:52 a.m., 5 minutes behind their agreed meeting time. The 28-year-old software engineer from Arlington emerged with the slightly frantic energy of someone perpetually concerned about being late, despite having driven the 120 miles to Shenandoah in record time. Thomas stood just over 6 feet tall with a lean runner's build, having completed 4 marathons in the past 2 years as part of what his friends called his quarter-life crisis adventure phase. His hiking gear was meticulously organized and expensive, from his carbon fiber trekking poles to his ultralight titanium cookset, all purchased after hours of obsessive research into gear reviews and wilderness forums. He had read every available piece of literature about black bear encounters, memorizing the recommended responses to different scenarios, never imagining that theoretical knowledge would dissolve into pure terror when facing 8-inch claws and crushing jaws. Lucas Ford's arrival at 7:03 a.m. completed their trio, his diesel pickup truck rumbling into the lot with the distinctive sound that had announced his presence throughout their college years at Virginia Tech. At 31, Lucas retained the broad shoulders and powerful forearms of his high school wrestling days, though his lifestyle as a construction worker foreman had replaced the discipline of athletic training with the practical strength that came from 10 years of heavy lifting and manual labor. Unlike his hiking companions, Lucas approached the wilderness with the casual confidence of someone who had spent countless hours hunting and fishing throughout the Virginia mountains. His gear was functional rather than cutting-edge, including a worn leather sheath containing a 4-inch fixed-blade knife that his grandfather had carried in Vietnam. Lucas believed, with the unshakable certainty of experience, that he understood the natural world and its dangers. The black bear that would end 3 lives before noon operated by rules that no human truly comprehended. The 3 friends had met during their sophomore year at Virginia Tech, brought together by a shared enrollment in an outdoor recreation class that required weekend camping trips throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Their friendship had survived the transition from college to careers, maintained through annual hiking expeditions that had taken them from the rocky peaks of Shenandoah to the remote wilderness areas of West Virginia and North Carolina. This September weekend was intended as their 8th annual trip, planned to coincide with the early autumn weather that brought crisp mornings and spectacular displays of changing leaves across the Blue Ridge ecosystem. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the lead wildlife biologist for Shenandoah National Park, would later testify during the federal investigation that September 6th represented a perfect convergence of factors that created an exceptional danger to humans in the backcountry. The unusually wet summer had produced an abundant acorn crop, drawing black bears into concentrated feeding areas along the ridge systems where the ancient oak forests provided the high-calorie nuts essential for building fat reserves before winter hibernation. Martinez's radio collar data from the park's ongoing bear research program showed unprecedented bear activity levels throughout the first week of September, with tagged animals moving constantly as they exploited the scattered mast crop. The biologist's detailed incident report would note that 11 separate bear encounters had been reported by hikers in the previous 72 hours, though none had resulted in aggressive behavior or human injury. Weather conditions on September 6th created additional complications that would prove fatal. The National Weather Service station at Luray recorded overnight temperatures dropping to 38 degrees, followed by rapid warming as the sun burned through the morning fog. This temperature differential created strong air currents along the mountain ridges, swirling and unpredictable wind patterns that would scatter human scent in multiple directions, while masking the approach of large animals moving through the dense understory. Humidity levels remained elevated from recent rainfall, creating conditions where sounds traveled differently than experienced hikers might expect. The soft, wet leaf litter that cushioned footsteps would also muffle the warning signs of an approaching bear until the animal was dangerously close. At 7:15 a.m., after completing their final gear check and reviewing their planned route, the three friends shouldered their packs and began walking toward the Appalachian Trail access point behind Skyland Lodge. Their intended destination was a designated backcountry campsite designated as Camp 42, located approximately 8 miles south along the Appalachian Trail, then 2 miles east on the Powell Gap Trail, to a remote hollow that promised solitude and spectacular views of the Piedmont landscape stretching toward Richmond. The total hiking distance for their first day was calculated at 10.3 miles, with an elevation gain of 1,500 feet and a corresponding loss of 800 feet, as the trail wound through the characteristic rolling terrain of the central Blue Ridge Mountains. Abigail led their small procession, setting a steady pace that reflected her experience with long-distance hiking and her awareness that they needed to reach their campsite with sufficient daylight for proper setup and meal preparation. Her medical training emphasized the importance of maintaining energy reserves for unexpected situations, and she had planned their daily mileage to avoid the fatigue that could lead to poor decision-making in the wilderness. Thomas followed approximately 20 feet behind, his longer stride naturally matching Abigail's pace, while allowing him to photograph the spectacular morning light filtering through the canopy of maple, oak, and hickory trees that dominated this section of forest. Lucas brought up the rear, his construction-hardened legs easily handling the moderate terrain, while his experienced hunter's eyes automatically scanned the forest for signs of wildlife activity. The Appalachian Trail corridor through Shenandoah National Park represented one of the most heavily traveled sections of the 2,100-mile footpath stretching from Georgia to Maine. On a typical September weekend, hundreds of hikers might traverse the same trails that Abigail, Thomas, and Lucas were following, creating a steady human presence that generally discouraged wildlife encounters. However, the early September timing of their trip coincided with the post-Labor Day reduction in casual hikers, while the serious backpacking season continued for those seeking the spectacular autumn foliage displays. This created an unusual situation where experienced hikers were spread thinly across vast wilderness areas, separated by miles of empty trail where human scent might not register for hours at a time. By 8:30 a.m., the three friends had covered approximately 3 miles of the Appalachian Trail, maintaining good time despite several photography stops where Thomas captured images of the morning mist rising from the valleys below the ridgeline. Their conversation flowed easily, covering topics ranging from Abigail's challenging cases in the emergency room to Lucas's latest construction project renovation, to Thomas's ongoing struggles with work-life balance in the technology sector. The familiar rhythm of long-distance hiking had settled over the group, that meditative quality where physical movement combines with natural surroundings to create a mental state distinctly different from urban life. None of them noticed the fresh bear scat deposited beside the trail approximately 50 yards behind their current position, or the distinctive claw marks scored into the bark of a massive white oak tree where a large black bear had marked territory during the previous night's foraging activities. Dr. Martinez's post-incident analysis would identify these signs as evidence that the adult male bear, later designated as bear number 347, had established a feeding territory encompassing nearly 4 square miles of prime acorn habitat, including the exact section of trail where the attack would occur. The bear's radio collar had stopped transmitting 3 days earlier due to a technical malfunction, leaving researchers unaware of the animal's precise movements during the critical period leading up to the encounter. Bear number 347 was a 12-year-old male weighing an estimated 630 pounds, making him one of the largest black bears documented in Shenandoah National Park's research database. Unlike the popular image of black bears as primarily omnivorous foragers, this particular animal had demonstrated increasingly aggressive behavior toward humans over the past 2 years, culminating in 3 separate incidents where hikers reported being charged or followed by an unusually large bear matching his description. Previous encounters had been resolved without injury when the hikers successfully backed away while speaking in calm voices, following standard bear safety protocols that assumed the animal's aggression was defensive rather than predatory in nature. Wildlife cameras positioned along game trails had captured extensive footage of bear number 347 during the summer months, revealing behavioral patterns that would later be analyzed by experts from the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources and the National Park Service. The videos showed an animal that moved with unusual confidence through areas of high human activity, displaying none of the typical avoidance behaviors that kept most bears safely away from hiking trails. Instead, bear number 347 appeared to actively investigate human scent trails, following footpaths for considerable distances and showing particular interest in areas where hikers had stopped to rest or eat. This pattern of behavior, while not unprecedented, represented a significant deviation from normal black bear responses to human presence. Dr. James Henderson, a bear behavior specialist from Virginia Tech's Department of Wildlife Ecology, would later describe bear number 347's actions as consistent with a phenomenon known as food conditioning, where individual bears learn to associate humans with easily obtained calories. However, the forensic evidence from September 6th suggested something far more concerning than simple food conditioning. The bear's attack pattern, the duration and intensity of the assault, and the animal's failure to retreat when confronted with human resistance indicated predatory behavior rarely documented in black bear encounters. Dr. Henderson's analysis concluded that bear number 347 had crossed a behavioral threshold that transformed him from a large omnivore avoiding conflict to an active predator capable of viewing humans as prey rather than as threats to be avoided.